Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Be There in 5 podcast. I'm Kate Kennedy, your host. This week we have 2 episodes, each spookier than the next. One, the regular episode, the spooky snorkel, is dropping on Halloween. It's about people's ghost stories. It's about my fascination with why ghosts aren't wearing more modern clothing, among other very pressing topics, like in the 90s doing light witchcraft at sleepovers and millennials. And I jest that this is the other spooky snorkel, but if I'm honest, it's genuinely about something I'm very scared of, and I think a lot of us are this week. And I know that there's a time and a place to compartmentalize and to escape, and this is predominantly a pop culture podcast, a millennial zeitgeist podcast, and I'm going to provide an escape for you, but also I don't know. I was having trouble standing idly by down to the wire, and just felt like I wanted to put my Be There in 5 cents in, if you will, about something that actually is quite relevant to the podcast and that we talk about a lot, which are misconceptions that people have about millennials, about millennial women. And today I just kind of wanted to address this idea that a lot of women, and specifically a lot of millennial women, are focused on reproductive rights this election cycle, and that it is a problem because it is a single issue vote. I think you almost have to take a step back and really think about the position we've been put in. So millennials right now are around age 28 to 43. I bring up how a lot of this noise is targeted at women of childbearing age because I think maybe we're the ones that are most vocal about it. But I also do think the addition of IVF into the repro rights conversation this past year following the Alabama ruling about an embryo being treated as a living person, it all has become all the more relevant to specifically millennial women of childbearing age, given that we're dealing with navigating all of this while having a finite number of fertile years for most of us left. And IVF is a big part of that conversation in what gives us options, opportunities, and chances to plan our future, just as having the choice in your life at any point is giving you autonomy over your body and the ability to make decisions about your future. I think what people forget is an argument I often make on here. I made it in my book. We straddle 2 very different eras, the traditional world we grew up in and the modern world we were greeted with. I think we're very defined by financial and economic instability, led by the greatest financial recession since the Great Depression, and its related implications on student debt, on building compounding wealth, on achieving the American dream, home ownership, on the affordability of children with current childcare costs. There are endless reasons we've kind of delayed our milestones, 1. And 2, another thing that we uniquely straddle is we also are a generation that came of age and entered adulthood, our 20s, our 30s, where we were making key decisions, believing that certain rights we held were settled law. They were rights. On what planet in a living, breathing, thriving democracy would rights and freedoms get rolled back? They're established. We maintain them. We add to them. We enhance them. And to come of age and to be in our core decision-making years for our futures with Roe v. Wade established, it wasn't just a Supreme Court decision. It was the backdrop against which we planned our lives, our careers, our families, our futures. And its overturning in 2022 was seismic for countless reasons. But at the heart of it, we're a generation that experienced for the first time in modern, keyword modern, American history, that a constitutional right was taken away from half the population. When we reduce reproductive freedom to a single issue, we're really undermining the intricate and intersectional impact it has on so many different touch points of American life, whether we're talking about educational access and access to sex ed, learning about and access to contraception, giving people the ability to make informed decisions about their health care, whether we're talking about economic opportunity from workplace discrimination to career advancement, whether we're talking about healthcare and equality in the medical system or racial justice and the alarmingly stark disparities in maternal health outcomes. This is about religious freedom. This is about privacy protection. There's so many things that fall under this umbrella of a single issue. And I think that I've been going a little crazy hearing people reduce our plight in this way. 1, because I guarantee you for any of us, it is absolutely not the only thing we care about. There are many, many issues that I and you, I'm sure, care a great deal about, that we put a lot of research and thought into, and that we take into great consideration when voting. to focus on one issue on this podcast or in general in these conversations is not to imply we exclude all others. And people love to use that assumption to write off your focus as insignificant because it is not all encompassing. And two, it's kind of being used as this condescending means to insult people and to shame people that lead with related causes. In the past couple weeks, especially, the rhetorical shifts that write off single issue voters as of late seems more like, honestly, at this point, a tactic to conceal it's a huge deal, not a realistic point of feedback that it's not as significant as we think. Last weekend, I just felt like I was going crazy following women, sharing their stories aloud at a Texas rally and seeing people on social media and in headlines and in my DMs calling it propaganda. Women sharing their stories of trauma and near-death experiences of loved ones they know who have actually died due to these restrictions, to suggest that these personal narratives are falsehoods in terms of how abortion restrictions affect everyday women. It's disgusting, it's offensive, and it's categorically incorrect. And to me, it's almost so obviously low and inhumane to deny or dismiss somebody's personal story of trauma or tragedy within the topic of pregnancy or childbirth, that the only option you have is to discredit it, call it propaganda, or just attempt to shame a person for being influenced by it. AKA minimizing a cause to being a single issue voter, talking about how single issue voters are a huge problem with this election, and ideally attempt to shame a person into losing energy to vote by feeling embarrassed that they are predominantly caring about an alleged singular issue. And that's part of what we're going to get into today. I crowdsourced real stories from real listeners of this podcast about the vast spectrum of reproductive care and the many circumstances that lie within it, from wanting to be pregnant, from not wanting to be pregnant, from trying to conceive and needing fertility assistance, to terminating for medical reasons, to being traumatized and tortured, having to cross state lines to get the necessary care you need, not because it's in your best interest, but because a medical provider has to prioritize their liability, to how the IVF now being involved in the conversation affects cancer patients, affects LGBTQ individuals, affects people like me who thought that I did egg retrievals under the premise that I was exercising a part of my reproductive freedom and I could have a semblance of control over my future for a process I underwent. Now people like me are having to ask ourselves, the way this election and the way the states respond to IVF-related laws, we could be looking at criminal liability for not using frozen embryos when that wasn't even a conversation anybody was having as recent as 2023. So I'm going to get into those stories. I want to talk a little bit more about the IVF piece because it's newer to this broader conversation of reproductive freedom. I think that both sides claim to support it, and it's really confusing. I think two of the most powerful things we can be talking about at this point are scientific fact over our confusing assumptions and distilling of rhetoric we're hearing from both sides who allegedly support IVF, for example, since that's a newer piece of the conversation that I do think deserves some clarity. We talk about on this podcast my concern with the erosion of the expert. And this is why I largely don't participate in political dialogue, because I don't want to pose as an expert on things that I'm not. I try to stick to areas where I have a semblance of expertise or personal experience, and this happens to be one as a person who had an emergency medical abortion of an ectopic pregnancy and a traumatic ER visit that I wouldn't wish upon my worst enemy, as a person who underwent the first half of IVF 2 egg retrievals following as a means to closely monitor the situation, being prone to ectopics, protect myself, be able to still tour and travel and promote the book without fear of trying to conceive and getting pregnant and being in the wrong state, in the wrong place, and having my life put on the line, in addition to unknown fertility issues. And I'm now a very proud mother that, if anything, becoming a mom has radicalized me to go even harder for pro-choice causes, because it's a common misconception that being in favor of abortion rights and wanting children or having children are at odds. But actually, they completely align because they're both about supporting reproductive freedom and choice. Because when we talk about reproductive freedom, we're talking about the broad spectrum of reproductive health care. And that includes every step of the way. And when somebody supports abortion rights, they're supporting the broader principle that all of us, each and every person, should have control over their own reproductive decisions and timing. Supporting abortion access isn't about being against having children. It's about believing that becoming a parent should be a choice you make intentionally. It should be a choice you make freely. It's a really big deal. And having gone through a pretty intense postpartum situation, I won't get into it, but I had postpartum preeclampsia with a pulmonary edema, among other things. Basically stopped breathing and had to go to the ER and stay in the hospital longer. And it was scary. It was serious. And if I hadn't realized it then more than ever, pregnancy isn't just some sweet process where you have baby showers and automatically get to deliver a healthy baby to term. For many women, it is anxiety producing, it is painful, it is punishing. And just as it can be perfect for people, for some people, myself included, it's the thing I wanted most, but it also turned out to be a major medical event that could have killed me if I were in different circumstances. This is why so many fertility doctors and reproductive healthcare professionals are strong advocates for both abortion access and fertility treatments, because they understand the fundamental interconnected nature of these two issues. And really the crux of it is fetal personhood, which we'll get into. And the point I was bringing up is, I speak from my own experience, sure, and there's bias, and you don't have to listen to me, and you can write off my experiences as singular and unfairly projected onto others, whatever, I don't care. But I really do care about bringing in experts when there are things that we don't feel as clear on, and I do think IVF is one of these murky areas. So I have snippets of an interview I did with the chief medical officer from Kindbody, who is a board-certified MD, who is a reproductive endocrinologist, among other very accomplished credentials, who is an expert in their field, who can scientifically tell us in the medical field when they believe life starts, the ways that government intervention in IVF could serve to be a huge, huge problem in access to, affordability of, and quality of care regarding IVF. And Kindbody, they are not political, they're advocates within their field. They don't necessarily share my views. And she provides a very neutral scientific stance. So I just want to make that clear, that I'm not dragging them into my mess, but I appreciate them being willing to speak to me to be able to provide you accurate information about how abortion restrictions might be impacting IVF as well. And I'm going to put up that full interview on YouTube with the doctor on Kindbody if you want to hear it in full. But there were so many different issues I wanted to address on the podcast. That's a piece of it that we'll incorporate here today, but maybe not all. But I guess I wanted to start by just kind of peeling this back a bit, like lifting the hood of womanhood, if you will. Like, the reality of reproductive freedom is that it is not a single issue. It affects every aspect of human life. It affects bodily autonomy, racial justice, healthcare access, fundamental human rights. It affects family planning, career decisions, educational choices, economic stability. These issues are inextricably linked in ways that I'm not deep diving in entirety in this podcast, but are worth noting. And I mean, even the class implications, look at when states impose waiting periods, multiple appointments. These things on the surface might look like inconveniences or giving a person an opportunity to further think their decision through, but they're also creating pretty challenging barriers for people who can't take time off work, for people that don't have transportation, that don't have childcare. These restrictions absolutely don't affect everybody equally, and it operates in creating a two-tiered system for healthcare access based on your economic status. And not all people that need reproductive health care identify as women, and not all women need the same reproductive care. And yeah, from preventing pregnancy to conceiving a pregnancy to completing a pregnancy to ending a pregnancy, whether induced or a product of an incomplete miscarriage or termination for medical reasons to IVF assistance with getting pregnant and beyond, there could not be more at stake. So yeah, I guess I just wanted to start by saying, when people suggest I should be focusing on, first and foremost, the future of our democracy, I assure them I am, because I think this single issue, if you will, I'm using quotes so you can't see me, is kind of the perfect barometer for the strength of a democracy, because to me it should be measured by how well it protects the rights and freedoms of its citizens. It doesn't create different levels of rights and tiers based on geography, economic status, or otherwise. It doesn't meddle in personal, private medical information and interfere with a person's ability to build their families and build their own future on their own terms. I think we're fundamentally undermining democratic principles of equality and justice if we suggest that reproductive freedom isn't absolutely essential to the vitality of our democracy. So yeah, I don't think reproductive freedom is a single issue. It's not one medical procedure. It's a matter of human dignity. It's a matter of opportunity. It's a matter of equality. And it's about who gets to participate fully in our democracy. And I might not be a woman in STEM, but I don't know, my back of the napkin calculations tell me that's not one issue. It's a matter of literally half the population's human rights. So if you want to minimize caring about these things to not being a big deal, to being insignificant, to being frivolous, go for it. You're bad at math. That whole preamble leading up to that point, you would have thought I had a sick or burn, but no, I don't. I'm really not here to try to call people names and insult candidates and go for the low-hanging fruit. That's the lazier thing I do all the time. But in the spirit of what I wrote about in One and a Millennial, honestly, the oldest trick in the book is making women's interests seem frivolous, as if caring about half the population's, basic rights are something insignificant or like a function of an uneducated single voter. And it's the oldest trick in the book to make women think caring about their own well-being is selfish, that we shouldn't be doing that we should be thinking about everybody else, we should be sacrificial, we should be the martyrs. And I personally believe that we can care about things that personally affect us in addition to what affects the broader public and people less fortunate than us. It's absolutely fair to protect ourselves in the process of advocating for others. And I don't know, don't let anybody tell you otherwise. None of the stuff I just said usually works, like the pontificating about the same stuff over and over again. Like, I can tell you stats, I can tell you the same talking points, but I don't really know how to get through to people sometimes. Because I could tell you, if you think that this is an issue that doesn't or won't affect somebody that's approximately 1 in 4 women are expected to have an abortion by age 45, based on 2020 abortion data, which is pre-Roe data, which, as we know, has gone up since the overturning of Roe v. Wade. But that includes a broad spectrum of circumstances that you likely weren't even taught comprise the issue of abortion, because it's so much easier to malign it as a worst possible scenario with intent to harm, when the reality is it includes people like me that had to choose between dying and having a medical abortion. It includes people that have incomplete miscarriages and need fetal matter removed from their bodies so they don't risk further pain, trauma, sepsis, infection, or worse, death. Medications and procedures that are used to manage and intervene medically with miscarriage management are the exact same as what is used for induced abortions. I think that people deserve to know the importance of factoring in nuance, because if you think you'll never have an abortion, that's fine, but you might be a person like me that never thinks you'll have one, but they had to choose between my tube rupturing, hemorrhaging, and dying, or medically aborting my desperately wanted child. And this applies to people with miscarriage management, incomplete miscarriages. In many cases, medical intervention is needed to remove fetal matter from your uterus in order to preserve future fertility. It often needs to be removed quickly. And you'll hear examples of how these restrictions, like in Texas, for example, of only being able to administer one medication when we know for a fact that 2 in conjunction work better. But these kind of religious-based policies infiltrating medical systems are limiting care options for people that aren't even practicing their religion and don't even believe what other people believe. I could tell you that 55% of people that obtained an abortion already have had one child, are parents. I could tell you that according to data from the CDC in 2021, 45% of abortions were obtained at 6 weeks gestation or earlier, 49% at 7 to 13 weeks gestation, and 7% at 14 weeks gestation or later. In addition to women that are disadvantaged in ways that limit access to services, women who receive diagnoses of fetal anomalies, maternal health complications, who have missed miscarriages, incomplete miscarriages, are disproportionately impacted because some of these diagnoses are received during the second trimester and would require a second trimester abortion procedure. And providers have to go out of their way and push people as close to death as possible to justify intervening when that wasn't the case before. You might be thinking, Kate, maybe you're like the only one that really cares a ton about this, but I don't think I'm the single person in this single issue. This actually, one of the reasons I reached out to Kindbody was because they recently, in partnership with the SCIMS in-house research arm, conducted a study for their 2024 State of Women and Fertility Healthcare Survey to uncover the key priorities, emotions, and concerns of women leading up to the 2024 presidential election, with the aim to amplify women's voices with tangible data and stories to present to employers and industry leaders and the community with how top of mind and important this is in ways that bolster the issue and don't minimize it. And 92% of those surveyed considered reproductive health care a priority. 75% shared a candidate stance that would influence their vote. 65% are very concerned that reproductive health care services might become restricted. 41% would consider switching jobs to a company that provides benefits or travel benefits for fertility health care. 51% would consider crossing party lines for a candidate that will protect access to care. 50% would travel to other states for reproductive services, and 24% would consider moving to another state with better fertility healthcare access. Just to name a few stats on even the fertility and IVF side of this. And the bottom line is reproductive healthcare is a key election issue, and it will influence how women vote. And it doesn't really matter what people think of that, honestly, but I guess I just wanted to give you my thoughts on it, maybe some talking points. I don't know. Ignore this whole introduction if you want to, because the most important piece here is getting some facts about one issue that I think is a bit murky, like IVF, and of hearing stories of real women who have faced real consequences from the Alabama legislation in February with embryos and fetal personhood. Even though that was kind of reversed in state soon after that, the period of time in between that, the Alabama ruling and when there was legislation to protect IVF providers was a microcosm for what this could look like on a larger scale if there is not a broader federal IVF protection that, by the way, was blocked twice this year by Senate Republicans being left to the states. This could be very dire, look very different, and people just trying to build their families. Providers could be facing criminal prosecution on the basis of policies written by uninformed individuals who are trying to implement laws from a religious, spiritual, or philosophical standpoint, quite literally in a country with freedom of religion, where you could be criminally prosecuted for not believing in something that you quite literally don't practice. And these decisions should be between medical providers and their patients. These decisions should be not based on doctrine, not based on dogma. This conversation to me is like so obvious. It feels like stupid to even relay to you because I know you know all this, but it's like, this is why it was put in place in the 70s. So first I want to get to some of the conversation I had with Dr. Jeelani, the Chief Medical Officer of Kindbody and a board-certified reproductive endocrinologist, who will share her perspective as a provider in terms of what's at stake with IVF in this election season, since it's being used as a talking point and a thing that both sides allegedly support. And even though she can't really speak to it from a political angle, I'll happily add my color commentary at the end. Then close to the hour mark, share some stories that were submitted to me about, like I said, this comprehensive spectrum of reproductive care. And I tried to read ones that represented different points of this process and different experiences the best I could with what people had written in, even though I couldn't get to everybody's. And I'm so grateful for people being so generous with their stories. Your stories deserve to be heard, and how dare your traumas and tragedy be written off as propaganda. It's honestly sick. And our lives aren't a game, and our futures and our families aren't an incidental talking point to be used for a politician's personal gain. If you're looking for a resource for your conversations in the upcoming days, if you're seeking to understand the broader scope of how these restrictions impact people, if you're concerned about your future family planning and IVF, I just was hoping to go beyond my thoughts and share an expert, and then share very real stories from podcast listeners about how this single issue affects people's lives in exponential ways. And I don't know if my rambling is making sense, but I don't have time to be more organized in my thought process. But oh no, I have a notification on my fake fireplace that it's out. Don't put out my fire. We're just getting started. But yes, today I'm fired up and doubling down on a single issue, if you will. So yeah, this one's for all of you out there, all the single issue ladies, if you will. I hated that. I feel like I don't have enough time to come up with something better. But yes, all you single issue ladies putting your hands up, to make a slightly regrettable, cheesy reference, but we'll go with it because time is not on my side. And to be fair, my internal soundtrack is no more sophisticated or dynamic than a 2014 DJ set at a barn wedding. And I apologize at points I do get a little upset during these stories. They were quite hard to read. At points I tried to re-record 4 times, and like it's so emotional for me, but I figured there's no point in even hiding that because that's just how serious and dire I think these circumstances are. And anyway, you guys, thank you for listening. Please don't email me any baby killing bullshit. I won't open it. I'll delete it promptly, and you simply cannot affect me anymore. Thank you in advance for doing your civic duty and going out and voting early or on Tuesday. It is absolutely essential that we all participate, and you don't have to agree with me. But I, at least as a person that represents a lot of women affected by this, and wanted to use this platform stating my piece for why millennial voters, particularly women, are approaching the 2024 polls with unprecedented engagement. And we're not just voting on one issue, we're voting on a highly interconnected system of rights and freedoms that affect every aspect of our lives, and don't let anybody tell you otherwise. In the introduction, I went over that Kindbody did a survey with the Skims in-house research, and the survey showed that 92% of respondents consider reproductive health care a top concern. So how do you define comprehensive reproductive health care?
If you asked me that question 10 years ago, I would define comprehensive reproductive health care as just the act of trying to get pregnant. But I think as we're evolving, it's just not the act of getting pregnant, but it's your end-to-end journey. You're from puberty all the way to menopause, post-menopause. That's your reproductive health span, right? How do you hit puberty? How do your hormones interplay? How does it impact your mental health? How does that impact your physical health? What happens after you give birth? What is postpartum depression? How do you navigate your hormones as you're going through the menopausal change? I think truly that's top of mind for everyone around us. Like, how do I best take care of myself and how do I best take care of my body?
I think an important thing to consider that broad spectrum because, you find when you start to cherry pick different parts of it to support or to, validate or invalidate or whatever, it's all interconnected. And the reality is none of us really know our fate the entire time we're alive as we navigate through all of those bodily and hormonal changes and our choices and chances as it relates to having children. So, yeah, I appreciate providers that really think about the full scope of that. And as it relates to the climate we're in now, given that reproductive rights could be a decisive election issue, what do you think voters need to understand about IVF's role in the broader conversation about reproductive health care?
I think voters need to understand that it's not just a reactive, like you go to IVF because, you that's your end resort. There's so many people that need IVF. You need IVF because you're a single parent by choice. You need IVF because you're a same-sex couple. You need IVF because you have cancer. You need IVF because you're predisposed to a genetic condition. That it just doesn't silo and impact this little small division, that it is a big thing. It does impact everyone. And there was actually not part of our study, but there was a study that showed that you will know 1 in 3 people that have been impacted by fertility and have gone through fertility treatment, whether it's IVF or some sort of intervention to help build their family of choice. And I mean, to say 1 in 3, that's insane. Like that number, it started 1 in 10, 1 in 8, 1 in 6, but to know 1 in 3, right? Like it's a huge deal. So to know that it's impacting people that are near and dear to you.
Yeah, that's staggering. I didn't know that. Yeah, between, 1 in 3, the statistic you just gave, or I think ACOG's stat, like 1 in 4 pregnancies results in miscarriage. And, when you think about reproductive rights and freedoms, it's just, you can pretend all you want. You don't know anybody affected by these things or that you'll never be that person. But the reality is statistically, it's probably closer to you than you even realize. And unfortunately, a lot of these things aren't spoken about or they're said in whispers and as a person that's done IVF, like there's kind of awareness too about defending yourself and feeling ashamed and people saying things like, why not just adopt? And people acting like it's selfish. And the way I always describe it to people is like, well, if my respiratory system wasn't working, if my nervous system, if any other system of the body isn't working, what do? Like you go get it treated, you get it fixed. And I just don't understand why the reproductive system doesn't register with people as necessary healthcare.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I think up until recently, it's been depicted as elective. Like it's always considered an elective procedure, an elective treatment. And that's why you see like 6 years ago, 7 years ago, a lot of insurance providers didn't cover it. And that's where this whole access to care, that mission for us came in for Kindbody, that it is not elective, right? It shouldn't be your last resort also. Like we believe in proactive management of your body and of your reproductive health, but it's not elective. I did not pick to have IVF, right? Like I didn't say, hey, pick me, choose me, but it's treatment. Just like you said, if I were sick, I would get treatment. And if innate part of my body is not functioning, then I'm seeking help to rectify it or treat it.
Right. And from what I understand, I mean, there's historically not been a ton of robust research with infertility, and there's still a lot of unknowns with infertility. And it's just not, I just really never want people to feel ashamed about it or like it's something that's their fault or it seals their fate or something, because that's not the case. You, in any other medical circumstance, you would not accept something not operating optimally as sealing your fate. So pivoting to the Alabama Supreme Court decision earlier this year, which legally classified embryos as persons from the moment of fertilization. First of all, what was your reaction as you're a reproductive endocrinologist and OB, you're the chief medical officer of Kindbody? I mean, what was your reaction when that happened?
I'm going to be very honest, and I'm going to speak to you as a patient because I've done a whole lot of IVF to build my family. And you can tell just in that sentence that if you say life begins at fertilization, it's just ridiculous. Because if they actually sat in the lab and saw how many eggs it took to have my son, 80 plus, it's just ridiculous. Like 80 plus of those embryos didn't work, didn't pan out in culture, didn't grow to the stage it needed to be, didn't implant, didn't, yield a live birth, to say something so absurd to me basically shows me that you don't comprehend what you're saying, right? You don't understand the extent and the attrition that our body is really good at survival of the fittest and showing us. And what IVF is only doing is amplifying that. So instead of one egg ovulating, we're super ovulating to figure out that one. So not all eggs fertilized will grow. Not all embryos that grow will be normal. Not everything that's normal will implant. So they just didn't understand that process to make such a big, staggering decision. And what it did was it was fear mongering. Then, if you don't know enough about it, then you start to question yourself. Like, does it begin at conception? Did that really happen? And that fear elicits like, do I do IVF? Do I not do IVF? Do I move states? And that's the last thing we want because, like you said, it is a very young field. We're still learning. And the last thing we want is to scare people out of pursuing this when they need it.
From a scientific/medical perspective, what is your definition of like fetal personhood? When scientifically do you consider and do medical professionals consider life starting?
So most medical professions say 24 weeks of conception. That's around your 6 months, because at that point, based on weight, size, and how far you've progressed, that baby is able to live outside of your body, still with a lot of intervention. But at that point, you can say, okay, they're surfactant, that the lungs are going to be able to move, that they can function. They have a lot of the reflexes that are needed. But prior to 24 weeks, life is impossible without the support of mother's functioning organs.
That's interesting. Yeah, there seems to be a neglect of the tools, the vessel, the other part of what an embryo needs to thrive. And it's becomes a really challenging conversation because for so many people, it's spiritual, it's philosophical, but the process itself isn't that.
No. And like setting all religious, philosophical beliefs aside, practicality is, I would love, right? Like I probably out of everyone, like I just miscarried at 8 weeks, miscarry at 8 weeks, miscarry at 8 weeks, even as a medical provider, I would love to say, let me incubate this baby for you and grow it outside and give it back. Right. Like I would have loved if hearing your body's attacking the pregnancy and you're miscarrying because of this clotting issue is hard, because that means without the support of the vessel and my body, this little embryo is unable to sustain life. And I think if you just break it down and take out all views, then you say, okay, well, at what point can this fetus sustain life? And that's beyond 24 weeks.
So how do legal definitions of personhood for embryos affect or stand to affect standard IVF protocols and practices?
So they threaten the cryopreservation of embryos, right? Even if it's frozen at an embryo stage, a lot of times 80% of our patients do what's called PGT, pre-implantation genetic testing. And it could be genetic testing for chromosomes. It could be genetic testing for diseases. It could be genetic testing for genes that you're worried about passing on to your children. The cryopreservation and them frozen at that state, even if they're deemed or labeled abnormal due to a variety of reasons, then they panic, because if you say, well, this embryo now is, has all rights of personhood, then you're worried about, what does that mean for me? Like, what do I do with them? How do I carry them on? That somebody raised child support, then someone else raised Social Security. I mean, it's like the wild, wild west out there, right? Like the minute you deem these cells, I call them cells because they're truly a cell, what happens if you label them as a person?
Right. And, it's speaking from somebody who has frozen embryos, they represent chances and they represent hope, but they're not my children. And nobody understands more than a person going through fertility treatments that an embryo is not a living, breathing child. Because if it was, how relieved would we all be? What a gift that would be. But a lot of people undergo failed transfers. I believe the statistic is 2 embryos equals 1 live birth, at least the last I checked, in terms of the statistical likelihood of a transfer resulting in a live birth. And speaking personally, I just find it profoundly offensive to even suggest that to people that want them to be children the most.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I couldn't agree with you more. So it's 3 tested normals for a 95%.
Okay.
Yeah.
3 tested normals for a 95%
chance of a live birth.
Okay.
2 gets you to 80.
Okay.
Now imagine if they're untested, right? And you're 40, I'm 41. That's like 6 to 7 embryo transfers to get to baby. And imagine if each one was labeled a child. And just like you said, I would have loved that. If someone said, hey, this process is so fine-tuned that the minute you fertilize it, it's going to become a baby. One can only hope that the science will advance to there. But we're definitely not there. And it's crazy to call a cell person when we know the fate of that cell likely will not result in a live birth.
So as a provider, were you and your peers, your community, like after Roe was overturned, as we were, shockingly regressing in our rights and our freedoms, is this something that was top of mind that realistically could happen? Did it come by surprise? I mean, it's kind of, when it was happening, I was like, oh, wait, this makes, unfortunately, too much sense that people weren't thinking through how writing these laws in anti-choice legislation would ultimately impact IVF because of how it perceives the start of life. But it's like now people are saying they support IVF who also support fetal personhood laws. And it gets really confusing because I'm like, does it just come down to a fundamental lack of understanding of when life starts and putting a spiritual religious emphasis in one area and a scientific on another? Like, did you guys see that confusion coming, or like the short-sightedness of trying to put those policies through coming, and that it would have consequences on fertility care?
I think so. I think the minute you reverse something that protected a thing, then leaves it up to interpretation. And I think what we're really seeing is people interpreting a decision or a science or a field of medicine that they don't quite honestly grasp, right? And it's not to the fault of them. I don't know if it's ill intent, bad intent. I don't know if everyone's riding this wave that this is a hot topic. Let me jump on it and talk about it. And I don't know what I'm saying. Like, I truly don't understand. But there's definitely a lack of understanding because it's very contradictory. Like, your actions are not speaking the language you're trying to speak. And and it's all around us. And it's just people I talk to. Like, I had somebody tell me that my babies aren't real because they're IVF babies. And I don't know what they were trying to say.
What does that even mean?
But, all I could think of was, well, you should take them home for one night and you'll know how real they are.
Oh my gosh, people are wild. When I was going through it kind of clicked with me that I was like, so let's say 30 eggs are retrieved. Each of this, like, obvious as this sounds, it didn't really click with me. It's like, okay, by the time I was all in with 2 retrievals, it was probably, 50 or 60 something eggs and single digits of embryos genetically tested. That's 50 to 60 months where one egg would be released. And each of those eggs represents one of my chances. And by the time I had experienced all of those chances, I'd be like 4 years older. My egg quality would have declined. My chances would have declined. And really what we're doing is expediting this process, as you said earlier. And once I thought of it like that, I was like, oh, this makes so much sense. This is a medical miracle that we can do this. There are many financial and economic and other reasons millennials have delayed milestones. We might be having kids later due to being a product of our time, due to the amazing enhanced opportunities that women have now, the information age and beyond. It's such a gift that we could expedite this process. And I think people, when they see this like harvesting and collection of eggs, they're not always thinking about it as like, well, one of those is released a month and those are all of your chances, and your chances decrease as you get older. And that's the unfortunate reality of fertility. So just a side note to anyone listening, that's how I, a non-woman in STEM, think about it.
Exactly. That's actually the best way to think about it. And believe it or not, I was like mind boggled. I remember I did my first retrieval and I had like MPCOS. I had like 30, almost 40 eggs. And at my follow-up is when I found out I had nothing make it to an embryo. And I literally was like, what do you mean? What happened? Like, I couldn't comprehend, I don't blame people around us or policymakers for not comprehending it, because I couldn't comprehend it as someone who had those eggs. Like, what did you do with all of them? Like, you fertilized them and they didn't develop, and how did they stop? Like, help me understand that. So I could understand why people don't understand, but what I guess frustrating is just then, when you don't understand about a topic, then it's don't speak about it because it's creating confusion. And I'm confused as a woman who has these eggs. Like, I can't imagine what others who are not going through this.
Right, right. Oh, for sure. It is such its own world, its own lexicon. Being inside of I think it inspires a lot of people to be advocates because it's a lot of detail that you wouldn't come across organically because it's so complicated. Okay, so going back to the previous conversation about medical definitions of personhood versus what happened in Alabama. So some lawmakers have proposed potentially limiting the number of eggs that can be fertilized or requiring all viable embryos to be transferred, among other, rumors and potential scenarios of things women could be required to do. What would these restrictions mean for patient safety, and what would they mean for treatment success?
Number one, it's going to be very hard, right? One of our limitations for fertility and IVF is the financial resources that are needed. It is very expensive to culture an embryo, to grow an embryo, get it to that genetic stage. And if we say life begins at fertilization, therefore we limit the number of eggs a woman fertilizes. If we say one egg, we fertilize it, we culture it, that's thousands of dollars you're going to pay to culture this one egg that may potentially not make it. So I think barrier to access and that financial burden is just going to tenfold. So I think we're going to limit the number of patients that come in if we speak about that. If we talk about, I have 30 plus embryos that are abnormal in the bank. If someone comes to me and says, well, those are all people and you're going to have to use them, majority of them will cause miscarriages and ectopic pregnancies because they're labeled abnormal. And that's going to put my life at risk. And that's the last thing we want, right? We want to use this to understand it, fine tune the process, and improve our success. We don't want anyone to suffer. And that can lead to lots of complications like infections, surgical interventions, blood loss. And we just don't want that. We don't want to put someone's life at stake because we have policies that don't make medical sense to that. And we're also going to have fear because then people may not want a genetic test. Because if someone comes to me, if I had those in the bank and says, well, they're not tested, now you have to use some. Now imagine all of the financial resources and the time it would take somebody in their late 30s, early 40s to go through those embryos to find the right one. Again, miscarriages, failed transfers, paying for cycles and medications.
Yeah, it's almost hard to even justify undergoing the whole process for just one-to-one because it's to arbitrarily pick a fertilized egg. We don't know which ones of those are going to successfully fertilize, right? So you'd just be picking at random.
Correct. So it would be like undoing the science that's advanced in such a little time that we understood that, hey, not all eggs make it to an embryo, so let's superovulate. Hey, not all embryos implant, so let's genetic test. Hey, not all genetic testings make it to baby, so let's figure out what's that. So it would be undoing that, not because we don't believe in that science, but purely because of fear.
What happened in Alabama was quickly reversed, essentially. But we saw in a couple weeks' time kind of a microcosm of what could happen on a larger scale, in that my understanding is if you make the donation, destruction, the, certain elements of frozen embryos have a potential for criminal liability, what happens from there? Providers shutting down, it becoming an issue of physical access of people just even having treatment options near them, what they call brain drain of talent and interest in going to certain areas. Can you talk through what happened in the couple weeks before it was reversed or before it was protected, and what that would look like for providers if there was a criminal liability?
I think in just those couple weeks, we saw the amount of fear elicited. A lot of people stopped treatment, right? As patients, mid-treatment, they are like, well, we're not going to go through this. I'm on injections. I'm just not going to do it. Some patients just reverted to egg freezing. They're like, well, if it's not fertilized, it's not considered a person, so I won't create embryos. I'll just freeze my eggs. Some providers, I think out of the 11 clinics there, over 50% of them shut down because they were worried about the prosecution or any legal implications of this. Patients started transferring embryos, not even out of state, but out of country, because They, just the
Hmm.
uncertainty. They're like, well, if this state can do it, maybe others will follow suit. I had patients transferring embryos. I mean, I'm on social media, so I did a lot of consults of like, what does this mean? What do we do? And they're like, oh, we're going to move our embryos to South America or to Europe or somewhere else because we lose trust
Right.
in our country and and that's the last thing we want.
So, and coming from a person who lies awake at night and thinks about this and is like, do I do this, my transfers like immediately because I don't know what's going to happen? And, you know, I don't know if you can answer this, but like, I think people are worried who haven't done it yet, who may need it. And I think people are also worried who have already done it and did it under the circumstances that existed prior where there wasn't any imminent threat of what you did with your frozen embryos potentially having, criminal implications. Should I be scared that like I would have to implant or transfer all of them? Or should I be nervous about things being reversed that because of legislation that was implemented after I did retrievals? Like, how do you kind of talk to patients who are working through that like fear and anxiety who have already done it?
The best thing I tell my patients to do is to play your part, to be involved. Like the last thing I wanted to do was be a doctor involved in politics, but unfortunately, just given our current climate, that's where I have to
Yeah.
be. Because if policymakers are going to make decisions about me as a patient, then I want to have a voice there. So be involved. Being proactive is the most important thing we could do. Make your voice heard. There's a lot of organizations who support and help fight for advocacy. Revolve, ASRM, there's great resources, but use your voice. And right, the last thing we want to do is be fearful and shut down. We want to take that fear and turn it into action. So make actionable steps and protect yourself, protect your future. I protect my embryos because I use my voice to speak up and say, hey, this policy is wrong. And if you look at Nebraska as a great example, a lot of their doctors are very involved in, but Nebraska tried to follow suit with Alabama, and they were able to shut a lot of these bills down.
So, going back to PGT genetic testing, that was something that we chose to do because a big driver was when you can rule out chromosomal unviability, it reduces the incidence of miscarriage on my part. And part of the reason I was there was to avoid heartbreak and to not be prevent that as much as I could. I guess just even explaining a little further how PGT fits into this conversation and how it may be controversial and why you as a provider think that it's important technology.
PGT is pre-implantation genetic testing of the embryo, and it tests the cells outside of the embryo that become placental cells. It's anywhere from 92 to 95% accurate. And what PGT has shown to do is decrease the miscarriage rate independent of age. And we know one of the biggest things that not all embryos implant and not all embryos implant make it to a live birth. And as we get older, especially that magic number we hear 35, 36, 37, it's not that our egg count drops significantly, it's that our quality drops. And that's why take home baby rate drops and our miscarriage rate goes up because once again, our body's really good at recognizing abnormalities and just saying we're going to miscarry it. So I personally, as a patient, like you said, it's heartache. It's putting your body through a lot of turmoil. It takes about 4 to 6 months to recover from a miscarriage or a pregnancy loss. And it's financial resources. So how I counsel my patients is PGT is expensive. And yes, not everyone's a good candidate for it. But if you fit this criteria, if you're presenting with recurrent loss, if you're older, then you're going to be paying a lot more money to keep going through transfers and failing or miscarrying, as opposed to genetic testing and finding the right one to implant.
Okay, that's really helpful. I'm just curious because the survey showed that 50% of respondents would travel out of state for treatment if necessary. Are there practical implications of creating a system where people need to cross state lines for fertility care? I mean, with the transferring of embryos, with timing, I mean, it seems like even that as a intermediary solution probably has risks associated with it.
Believe it or not, a lot of patients wanted to move their embryos out. I've had patients move their embryos to me because they were in states that they didn't feel they were well protected. And I think, like you said, you need to be able to sleep at night, to know that you're in a place where you can trust that the policymakers will be in your favor, will understand the implications of reproductive rights and justice, whether it's going to happen or not, but that uncertainty will drive you crazy, right? So I think it is important here at Kindbody. We offer it more in terms of access to care as part of our enterprise benefit, because there's also fertility deserts. Reproductive endocrinologists are hard to find, and not a lot of us graduated here. So there's areas where there's just no fertility care and patients have to travel. So there's a political aspect of it, but there's also an aspect where you just don't have access to fertility doctors.
Well, and also the survey indicated that like cost was a huge barrier, with treatments reaching around 20,000 per cycle. Just curious, how do current insurance policies affect access to IVF, and what changes would like make the biggest difference? And even, it's not even just insurance coverage in general, but it's also like insurance coverage might, limit LGBTQ plus individuals, specifically receiving coverage. And can you just talk a little bit about the barriers that exist today with insurance coverage?
So it's a state by state. So how it's currently worded is each state gets to determine and decide if they're going to cover fertility. And most states don't cover fertility. And how they cover it is they may put lifetime maximums on it, or put no embryo banking clause on it, that say you do a retrieval and you have 3 embryos, you have to use all of them up before you transfer, which I had a patient literally tell me like they robbed her of possibly having a second because she was 41. They said, no more IVF, you have embryos. She went and transferred, got pregnant, came back and used her last one. Didn't work. And by the time she came back, she was 45 and just couldn't do any more IVF because the chance of taking home a baby at 45, even through IVF, is low. Just we can't defy biology. And she literally was like, I feel like they robbed me. They robbed me of my ability to have a baby because there's banking clause on there where insurance is same thing. Whoever wrote that policy said, well, you can't bank embryos because we're treating your infertility. And how we treat it is you do IVF and you transfer. Or there's certain insurance that say, well, you have to be exposed to sperm for 12 months to be deemed infertile. And if you're a same-sex couple, that's going to be very hard to be exposed to sperm, right? Like, and that's where that mental health component plays in, because now you're not only telling them that they can't use their benefits for treatment, but you're also telling them that their way of life doesn't meet the definition. Like it's just mind-boggling that we're so progressive in one arm and then so backwards in the other, right? So each state gets to determine whether they cover infertility or fertility benefits. Then from there, each employer gets to determine how they cover fertility and if they need to cover it. And then from there, there's also loopholes to that. Like Illinois is a mandated state, but if you have less than 90 employees, if you're affiliated with a union, if you're affiliated with a religious institution, then you're exempt from covering fertility.
Oh, I didn't know that. What did you say? Yeah. If you're a religious institution, less than 90?
Employees, or if your unions don't have to follow the mandates.
That's interesting. And is coverage something that could be required by law of private companies? Is that something you guys advocate for? Or like, I guess I didn't even realize it. Has it always been at the state level? Is that something new?
No, it's always been at the state level. So each state gets to decide whether they or not they cover fertility. Believe it or not, the federal government, up until maybe a year ago, did not cover any fertility. But very recently, they're still not at IVF yet, but recently federal employees are getting IUI coverage. If you're a veteran, you have 0 fertility coverage. I think recently they started covering IUIs again, but same thing. You have to jump through loopholes. You have to figure out your why. You need prior authorization. The biggest thing you could do is get involved with Resolve. There's a drop-down menu and you can put in the state and it'll tell you if that state's mandated, does it cover anything, and who your point of contacts. They have local state-by-state Resolve advocacy groups that you can actually go fight for this. And California actually became mandated about 2 weeks ago.
Yes, that's right. That's so interesting, too, because to be restrictive around prior authorization and like diagnoses for something that a lot's not known about and is quite challenging to diagnose makes it all the more the optics of coverage are great, but if there's going to be a lot of language in there about diagnosis in a field where there's not a ton of research or knowns, that just probably makes it even more difficult.
Yeah. And it's crazy because then they'll go to the patient, like as a doctor, what's so frustrating is I had a patient yesterday. Well, I called my insurance and they said I have no fertility coverage unless I have an underlying medical diagnosis. And I was like, well, when they say that to you, they mean that you're at risk of losing your ovary because you have cancer. And then they'll cover it. But if I say you have PCOS and infertile, they won't cover it because then you bounce back into elective and you're subfertile, not infertile.
Oh, I've never heard that.
Yeah, it's all these nuances that I unfortunately learned from being a patient and having to, you get stuck like running between your doctor and then running to your insurance and then waiting for, it's like stop, wait, go, no, stop, wait. It's the most frustrating thing.
It really is. And I think that all the while you're navigating a lot of the mental load and mental health element of really something I think people don't put enough stock in terms of its difficulty, which is your reality departing in such a way from your expectations that you're really spoken to about, having children. I call it the marriage, baby carriage pipeline. It's just, you're told like it's really straightforward to find the right partner and you'll have babies and all these things. And when women don't talk about this process, there's a lot of isolation and a lot of disappointment. And to be navigating the like practicalities of insurance and finances, all the while kind of dealing with that trauma, it's just like, why are we putting people through so much?
Yeah.
It's cruel to me. But anyway, no, I so appreciate your time. And, I know we talked about getting involved with the Resolve and being an advocate. When patients express anxiety about future access to care, we talked about addressing their concerns, but, is there any element of like maintaining hope you can give in addition to practical guidance? I feel like going into this election, there's just like so many unknowns, and that might be the reality. And maybe the reality is we should be scared and we should be alarmed and called to action. But are there any like protections in place or any at the federal level or at all that we can like rest easy on or not?
But to be honest, the short answer is there isn't,
Okay.
right? Because it's truly up in the air. But I think what I find solace in, and I live in Illinois and we all kind of know how Illinois favors. And I think not just at the national level, but truly know your policymakers at your local government levels. Because if we're going to leave it to the hands of local leaders, don't just think about this every 4 years, but think about this at every level, every state level, every local level, every city level, because all of those people are integrated. And this is where these policies start. So I hate to keep saying this, but truly understand where you're at. And as a patient, right now I'm comforted because I know where I am and where my embryos are, but that could change in a heartbeat. And the only thing I could do is try to understand my candidates.
That's such a great point because, we're talking about this in the context of a presidential election, but there's not only a lot of really relevant reproductive items on the ballot in, I think, 10 states. There are also a lot of local elections we should be paying attention to. And I didn't even know that IVF was already at the state level. So if I understand correctly, the rolling back of reproductive rights kind of opened a window for policies to be introducing fetal personhood laws that could impact IVF, but that was already at the state level.
Correct. Fertility coverage was already at the state level. And I think what reversing of Roe v. Wade did was to further say, okay, all of this will lie at the state level. And then even though it had nothing to do with fertility, it opened the doors to say, well, when does conception actually start? What does this mean? How does it impact not only once you're pregnant, but before you're pregnant? So fertility coverage was always at the state level.
Okay.
This just kind of married the two.
Well, Dr. Jeelani, this was so helpful. I'm so grateful for your time. I know my listeners are too. And thank you for all of your advocacy. And thank you for being part of what I trusted for my future family. Kindbody's the best. So thank you for being a part of this.
Of course. Thank you for having me. It is the best.
Normally, when I'm crowdsource and read stories, I will like react and add color commentary. But those of you who wrote in were so incredibly generous to share what are often incredibly traumatic experiences with me. I know it's not fun to relive, rewrite, and I just want to get through as many as possible. And so let's now read through some of people's experiences. My story is long-winded, true, be there in 5 fashion, but sharing this is so important to me. If I could walk around with a badge that says, you can talk to me about your miscarriage, abortion, healthcare without it being weird, I would. Not having access to mifepristone in Texas changed my trying to conceive trajectory, and being made to feel like my medical event was somehow religious in nature left me feeling robbed of so many things. Writing this out was cathartic. Thank you for the space. For context, I live in Austin, Texas, and when I knew we were about a year or so out from trying to have a baby, I did a ton of sourcing to find an OBGYN that aligned with my values, science, healthcare, etc. I took an appointment 8 months out to get established, and I'm beyond glad that I did because I know our miscarriage experience would have been even worse without a doctor who was on the same page. We found out we were pregnant on July 4th, over the moon excited. First pregnancy and so much joy. I started spotting around 7 weeks. At the time, my HCG levels were rising normally, but we hit a point where my doctor suggested heading into the ER. We went to the hospital near us in the suburbs of Austin, and after the typical ER rundown, blood work, transvaginal ultrasound, etc., the male ER doctor came into our room and said, essentially, this is a miscarriage/blighted ovum. Your pregnancy isn't going to go forward. This happens all the time. You'll see your doctor in 2 days for a follow-up. We left heartbroken and confused. Later that day, my doctor called me and shared that the ER doctor should not have given us a prognosis and shared that things could very much go either way and she'd see us the next day. When we saw my doctor, she explained that there's no way to make a diagnosis like this with one singular ultrasound. At this point, we had a gestational sac, no yolk sac or fetal pole. We scheduled a follow-up for around 3 weeks later, and my doctor suggested that we should prepare for both outcomes. The next 3 weeks were awful. I started spotting the day I saw my doctor at around 7.5 weeks and was still nauseated by the smell of coffee. Things felt like they might be looking up, but we were doing our best to simmer our expectations. At 10.5 weeks, we went in for my follow-up appointment. Again, on the ultrasound, we saw just a gestational sac. By this point, the gestational sac had grown in size and reached the threshold to be called a missed miscarriage, where development had fully ceased, but my body hadn't processed the pregnancy was not viable. My HCG levels were incredibly high at this time, and my doctor advised 3 different options. 1, wait it out naturally. This could take up to 6 weeks, given my hormones weren't showing any sign of decreasing. 2, medical abortion with misoprostol. I always get tongue-tied saying that. Sorry if I'm saying it wrong. Or 3, an in-office DNC. I'd researched these options ahead of time and felt most in control with option 2, the medication route. My doctor felt confident this route was a solid care decision, but did extensively go over what complications could arise and how to handle them. If we had a complication zone, she advised that we go to the ER in downtown Austin, the hospital affiliated with the UT Medical School, to be able to receive the best version of care. She noted 2 things that really stuck out. 1, she included copious notes with a prescription to justify why I needed them and to call her office if we ran into any issues getting misoprostol at the pharmacy. And 2, we shouldn't go back to the hospital in the suburbs during this process due to their inability, lack of experience, towing the line with state law to provide care that may be needed. I mean, talk about added stress, right? My body wasn't able to process the fact that we were having a miscarriage. We might have difficulty getting the med needed to support my body and moving to the next phase to be able to try again. But also we needed to be incredibly mindful of where and how we were to seek care should that be needed. We got the meds on a Friday. I administered them at home Saturday, August 17th. I'll spare you the details, but that day was incredibly hard for all the reasons you can imagine, physically for me and emotionally for my husband. Key element here, we live in Texas where OBGYNs cannot prescribe mifepristone to patients. In other states, it is standard care procedure to prescribe both mifepristone and misoprostol for a medical abortion. When medical abortions have both medications, the effectiveness of the medications is incredibly high. Without mifepristone, the effectiveness rate decreases and the risk for complications increases. I had a girls' trip to Chicago scheduled about a week and a half later and cleared with my doctor that I'd be okay to fly. I was feeling better physically, bleeding had slowed down, I was in regular pads and felt like I could really use a change of scenery. While my flight from Austin to Chicago was landing, I all of a sudden had intense back pain and felt like I was bleeding through my pad completely out of nowhere. I felt sick to my stomach, and while we taxied at O'Hare, I was calculating how I was going to get myself to the bathroom on the plane to assess the situation. I made it to the bathroom on the plane, and it was like I had just taken the abortion med all over again. It took me 2 full hours to get myself off the plane, to baggage claim, and to the Uber line, stopping in the bathroom 6 different times, changing my overnight giant pads 4 times. This should have been a major red flag to head to the ER, but I was alone, completely exhausted from blood loss, texting my husband to locate in-network hospitals, and just attempting to make it to the next step. I hadn't shared quite yet with my friends that we'd been expecting and going through all of this, but as soon as my Uber arrived at my friend's apartment, I bled through, and my cool girl Spanx sweatpants betrayed me. My friends were total gems. Female friendship is the most special thing on the planet. After taking a shower and eating, my bleeding slowed down and then stopped. I called my doctor's emergency line, ran through all the things they advised me to keep an eye on the bleeding. If it were to pick up again, head to the ER. Aside from being mortified in the O'Hare airport and completely drained from bleeding, things leveled out over the next 2 days. It felt like I was on the other side. Fast forward another week, a full 3 weeks after I had taken my Suprastol. I was walking my dog with my husband and started having back pain. I genuinely thought, oh, maybe my period's coming back. Later that night, my husband was out with a friend and I was home solo watching Gilmore Girls, as one does. I all of a sudden had the same feeling that I did on the plane, intense back pain, feeling like I was going to throw up. I went to the bathroom and again, it was just as if I had taken the meds. I went back and forth from the shower to the toilet for over an hour, bleeding nonstop. My husband came home and found me sitting on the shower floor, conscious but not all the way there. After getting me out of the shower and dressed, we called my doctor and made our way to the specific downtown/medical school ER. I actually remember stopping to put my wedding rings on because I thought, is this how I avoid getting in trouble for this? Is this how I get the care I need? When we were checking in, I literally handed the nurse my insurance card and my Costco membership card. That's how barely there I was after losing so much blood. I'll spare you the full ER saga, but in short, I had an incredible ER nurse and the OBGYN resident and attending on-call were top-notch. My doctor was right, this hospital knew what they were doing. By the time we reached the pelvic exam, I was so overwhelmed and couldn't handle the sounds of the ER anymore. I had my partner blast Cruel Summer throughout the entire thing. Talk about a different experience when I heard it at the Air store in Miami a few weeks ago. It took approximately 5 hours, but they arrived at the conclusion that the medical abortion with my Suprastol did not work completely. I still had products of conception in my uterus. By the time they were prepping the OR to put me under for an emergency D&C, I was fading in and out of consciousness, sweating, throwing up, and shaking. Great care, but here comes the very Catholic part. When I woke up in the post-op room and started to come out of anesthesia, the nurse had a question for me. This hospital is affiliated with the Catholic Church. To honor this pregnancy and the life of the baby, how do you want to handle the remains? The remains, were they serious? Do they mean the blood clots of my gestational sac? I was speechless and my partner was ready to come out of his chair. They provided 3 options. 1, pick them up in 2 weeks yourself. 2, a mass burial blessed by a priest along with a notification of when and where it took place. 3, a mass burial blessed by a priest without notification. This was the most wild experience of my life. We're church people, we attend a Methodist church and are incredibly active in our community, but religion brought into this traumatic medical event. This isn't a God thing, this is a medical event. Absolutely insane. This added another layer of trauma to the overall experience that rocked me. We chose option 3, not to be notified. My mom flew the same day to take care of us. I missed a week of work and my husband and I have been in a lot of therapy. When I went to my follow-up appointment with the OBGYN, she relayed that would not have happened if she'd been able to prescribe both mifepristone and misoprostol. She shared that she's currently in the process of figuring out how to sign her life away to be able to administer the medication in her office so that this doesn't happen to other patients who choose the medication route. I knew that if I hadn't chosen the medication when I did at 10.5 weeks and gotten the process started, had my body not started to miscarry naturally until later, 12 plus weeks, I would have had a vastly different, likely health-altering experience that may have been a name in the headlines. I could have very easily been Amber Thurman. I recognize my immense privilege in all of this. I'm a white 20-something woman, beyond supportive partner, health insurance, the education to seek out a healthcare team that aligns with my values, and the means to afford multiple ER visits. This entire experience was truly horrible. Not having access to mifepristone made everything worse and it lasted a lot longer. It increased my healthcare costs exponentially. No one talks about having a stack of bills but no baby. Yeah. It introduced more trauma than necessary, and it robbed us of time. Had my medical abortion been completed in August, I would have had a different path to recovery and maybe even a quicker path to trying to conceive again. I've been pro-choice for a long time, but I'm hopeful there's a day when we have a standard of care that actually prioritizes women's health care and empowers them to make their own decisions that aren't limited by the government. Thank you for sharing. It's so cruel. I'm so sorry. Think about that in addition to grieving, like all the physical and emotional trauma is and the fact that it's unnecessary and that you had to go through that because politicians write this stuff into policy for sport to galvanize voters for things they don't even understand, to make it look like it's this myopic issue when it's not. We had to use IVF to conceive our first child after I was diagnosed with diminished ovarian reserve and my husband had male factor infertility. We were super lucky that it worked and we had a healthy baby in 2022. Once we were ready to try again, we figured we could see if we could conceive without treatment for a few cycles and miraculously got pregnant without IVF. Everything was proceeding normally until a nuchal scan at 13 weeks when we learned our daughter had a fatal condition. She had severe swelling, an enormous cyst on her neck and brain, and was losing amniotic fluid. The swelling also put me at risk for Muir syndrome, which would cause severe blood pressure issues that could eventually become life-threatening. Unfortunately, we live in Georgia, so termination for medical reasons was not an option. I had to take in this devastating news at the same time that I realized I had no options to care for myself or my baby. The doctor said our baby would die at some point between now and full term, or shortly after delivery, and our only option was to continue coming in for a scan to see if she had passed yet. 2 weeks later, I had to see my baby's heartbeat and her move around and felt like a horrible human for being upset she was still alive. How long would she continue suffering? How long would I carry her? All while my belly grew and people started to ask about my pregnancy and congratulate me. It was the most horrific, stressful experience of my life. After that scan, I couldn't bear to continue and didn't want my child to suffer any longer. We had to search and find contacts out of state for hospitals and abortion clinics who could perform a termination, which was complicated at times because we didn't have a formal diagnosis. We finally ended up terminating at 16 weeks, and I miss my baby every day, but I'm glad I was able to do the compassionate thing by ending my pregnancy for her and myself. Finding out we would lose our daughter was awful enough, and it was made so much more difficult by our state's abortion ban. I'm now thankfully pregnant again through IVF. Without IVF, I don't think I would have felt comfortable getting pregnant again because of where we live. Our embryo was genetically tested, so we were hopeful of eliminating having to go through a termination for genetic conditions again. After what I've been through, I'm so passionate about what these laws mean and how it's absolutely not pro-life to make a woman who desperately wants a child to go through this or to make babies suffer in the womb or upon delivery. Thank you so much for sharing. This is the next email. I live in Texas, and in late 2021, I found out I was pregnant for the first time. My husband and I were ecstatic. In January of 2022, I went to the doctor for my 8-week ultrasound/confirmation appointment. During the appointment, I found out that while there was a sac present in my uterus, there wasn't an embryo. They call this an anembryotic pregnancy or blighted ovum, but I think that term is fucked up and it makes me sad. Long story short, there was no embryo, which means there was definitely no heartbeat, but my body didn't seem to know that. I still had all the pregnancy symptoms, sore nipples, nausea, etc. My choices were to let my body recognize that the pregnancy wasn't viable on its own, get a DNC, or take medication to remove the pregnancy remains from my body. This is an abortion regardless of the fact that there was no embryo. I chose the medication. The complication was that in September of 2021, Texas had passed the Texas Heartbeat Act, which banned abortion after a heartbeat is detected. While none was detected in my case, things were complicated, and the Texas bill allowed for ordinary citizens to essentially be bounty hunters and turn people in who they suspected had an abortion. My doctor ended up prescribing me one medication instead of the two she normally used. She said there would be less issues with me being able to fill my prescription, and there was a ton more paperwork if she were to prescribe the 2-medication regimen. But guess what? The 2 medications work better together, and there are more side effects using just misoprostol. The medication ended up working fine, but it's absolutely horrifying that my doctor couldn't make the decision that had the best probability for a positive outcome. Today, I'm a mother of a beautiful, nearly 2-year-old boy, but as I think about getting pregnant again, I'm terrified of what could happen to me here in Texas. I'm 38, and pregnancy can become more complicated with age, and there's a higher risk for everything. So I thought that was interesting. It kind of shows 2 examples of, like, for some people it works, for some people it really doesn't. But the sickest part of all is that we know for a fact that both work better together and generate more positive patient outcomes. And with these stricter abortion laws, providers are not able to do that. My elder sister was always the girl with problem periods. I remember my mother putting her on birth control pills in middle school to manage her issues. Fast forward to midlife, and at 51, she had progressed to fibroids and consistent bleeding, the latter of which led to a host of other issues, including migraines, anemia, lack of energy, etc. Her OBGYN arranged a partial hysterectomy to remedy these issues, and again at 51, she was happy with this decision. She had all the pre-op appointments and got the clear to have surgery on Halloween 2018. Unfortunately, as they were prepping for surgery, they turned her away. "You're pregnant, we cannot perform this procedure on you," they told her. She and her husband were aghast. She was vehement that they hadn't had intercourse, certainly not in the last week. She was told that she had HCG in her blood and therefore was pregnant and to seek prenatal care. She had a vaginal ultrasound and there was no baby. "It's too early to show," she was told. In the subsequent week, she was tested for her HCG levels. They were low, the fetus was growing, but very slowly and not at the rate of a normal viable pregnancy. It was posited she might have an ectopic pregnancy as there was still no baby in the ultrasound, and that this needed to be treated as it could be a threat to her life. She went to her OBGYN terrified. He confided in her, "I know you were not pregnant, but the new abortion rules just passed in early November. It's not about the physical presence of a fetus, but the medical records of a pregnancy. If I treat you for anything other than pregnancy, I will lose my privileges at this one-horse town hospital. You have to travel to get treated." She did. It was not a slow-growing fetus, nor a pregnancy of any kind. It was a cholangiocarcinoma, better known as bile duct cancer. It's an aggressive and rare and deadly cancer. It's especially deadly because it is generally symptomless until it is too late. Unfortunately, after the waiting game of the first trimester, it was too late. She passed away the following July. The irony is not lost on me that she died around the time this phantom fetus, if conceived in October, would have been born. In all fairness, do I think she'd still be here 5 years later had she been treated immediately? Maybe, but probably not. It's still a deadly and rare cancer, and there's not a chemotherapy, at least as of 2019, that could effectively cure it. But what I wouldn't give for a few more weeks, a few more months, my goodness, even one more day with her. And to think that if she were a man, there would have been a possibly different outcome eats away at my angry feminist soul every day. It's also worth noting this cancer has a genetic link, and I'm now 51. A couple of months ago, my period was late, and you can imagine the mental gymnastics that were going on in my mind. Thank goodness I lived in Virginia, and while it's a little too purple these days for my taste, I still have rights for now. Thank you for sharing, and I'm so sorry for your loss. I'm in my late 30s and I have 4 children and have worked for the abortion amendment in our state, Arkansas, which was thrown out on a technicality. In the past 6 months, I've had 2 friends, after years of infertility, become pregnant and find out between 15 and 18 weeks their baby had severe medical and physical issues and would not survive if they made it to term. Since neither of their lives were in immediate danger, both had to leave the state to have procedures. That alone was horrific. The governor of Arkansas, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, tweeted out after she used her power to put pressure on the AG to throw out the abortion amendment, "Not only are they baby killers, they are inept." One of my friends, a pillar of the community, is leaving the state over it. It's absolutely awful. Thanks for talking about this. It's so important. Thank you for sharing. Unbelievable. In late September of 2022, I was living in Texas and I found out I was 5 weeks pregnant, very early to find out. I basically realized my period was a week late, took a test, and there were the results. This was an unplanned pregnancy between my and my wonderful boyfriend, who's now my fiance today, and mutually for many reasons, we were not ready to have this baby. The abortion ban in Texas took place in May of 2021, so this legislature directly affected me, and the realization that I now had to plan an out-of-state abortion consumed me with anxiety. I had to figure out where and how this was going to happen, what I'd do with my job, and what recovery would look like. Mind you, the abortion ban laws included a $10,000 fine for Texas women caught having an abortion and the threat of life in prison. I now felt like I had a target on my back and was afraid to tell anyone of my situation for fear of it spreading to the wrong conservative Texan. This left me feeling isolated, alone, and paranoid, plus adding to the immense amount of fear and sadness I already had. In mid-October, 2 weeks later, I had a pre-planned weekend trip to visit my family in Vermont for my stepfather's birthday. I figured since I was already flying to New England, I should plan my abortion around that trip to find a Planned Parenthood in a neighboring state, since thankfully a majority of those states protect abortion rights and access. My boyfriend and I settled on meeting in Providence, Rhode Island. He would fly in from Texas because he was not joining me on my family trip. After my few days in Vermont, I would get my abortion there. This required my boyfriend to purchase flight tickets to meet me, us paying for an Airbnb, for my recovery, getting a rental car, finding dog care. These expenses we were privileged to be able to cover, but certainly were not budgeting for. The total cost of the trip plus abortion came out to well over $3,000. My abortion experience at Planned Parenthood was nerve-wracking, as I never wanted this to happen, but the care from the staff was superb, and it was their expertise and gentleness that put me at any kind of ease. No one questioned my decision or made me consider other options. They put my health care and wishes first, respecting my decision, my body, and my humanity. There weren't even abortion protesters outside the clinic like you might see in Texas, since abortion is a very protected right in Rhode Island, supported by a huge majority of the residents. I was now 7 weeks, so I chose to take the abortion pill. Over the next 24 hours, I was curled up in bed or by the toilet with horrible cramps and frequent visits to the toilet that will haunt me. Apologies for being graphic, but the amount of blood I passed and the amount of pads I bled was frightening. However, it was expected and considered normal. The pain, sadness, grief, and anxiety I had in my body felt nearly inconceivable. And for 48 hours, I was in an Airbnb bed with none of my personal comforts, things, not my dog. Not to mention, I couldn't take any time off work, so during the daytime, I had to be logged into my computer working for my remote job, showing up on Zoom calls. After 48 hours in Providence, we flew home to Texas, still in major discomfort and bleeding and cramping. It was the longest flight of my life. I had not told any of my family who I was with in Vermont of my pregnancy or my planned abortion. I hadn't even told anyone besides one best friend. The Texas laws made me feel ashamed of myself, targeted, and like I was guilty of a crime I never wanted to commit. By July 2023, my boyfriend and I moved out of Texas and back to New England, where we both are from. This abortion experience was the defining reason for this move. I have to live in a state where my personal health decisions are protected. Again, a very privileged stance in reality I'm able to have now. While I face difficulties, trauma, and inconvenience, my story is probably way less traumatic or dangerous or scary as other Texas women's. I have a loving, supportive partner, the means to afford the entire trip, and the opportunity to be in a state where abortion is legal. I'm still recovering from many layered feelings of this whole experience and PTSD, but if anything, it expanded my compassion beyond what I thought was already possible for women who choose to get abortions or who medically need one. I've always been pro-choice, but now have the perspective to really understand the weight of needing these laws in existence. Thank you so much for sharing. I live in Alabama and was impacted by the Alabama Supreme Court decision earlier this year, where embryos were deemed extrauterine children, and then our IVF clinic shut down and we could not access our embryos for a number of weeks in February and March. We were married in 2021 in our mid-30s, and I've been trying to have a child ever since. I've had 2 miscarriages, one of which was an 8-week-old pregnancy created as an embryo through IVF. The delay of our second transfer due to the Supreme Court decision was heartbreaking, and we did eventually have a transfer in late April after waiting 6+ months to make it a reality. I'm due with our daughter in January 2025. It was unbelievable that one small note in my overall personal medical history, infertility, and medical diagnosis, which should be between me and my doctor, was suddenly up for discussion and a treatment was denied to me. I felt forced to decide if I would make this medical situation of mine public or not, decide if I would dip my toes into advocacy, and I decided that it was the time that this was my issue. So we contacted the New York Times and with a deep breath talked to a reporter. I think a lot of people think that women in Alabama are a certain type of person, but we are such a diverse group. I'm originally from Wisconsin. My spouse is from the Rocky Mountain West, and we are in Alabama because we enjoy it here, and we enjoy our jobs, and we have amazing friends. But I feel such a deep distrust of our government leaders that they do not see us as passionate, educated, worthy members of society who deserve healthcare and support. I never thought I'd do IVF. I didn't know any other women who have done it. I assumed it wasn't for me until it was the best option and I was faced with it. I am so glad for it and so glad for our supportive and super intelligent doctors who have seen us through this long journey. A journey I managed to keep fairly private until the moment came where I couldn't anymore and decided to be an advocate. This is one of the pieces she sent me that I can quote. When I first read about the IVF ruling, I was absolutely outraged on behalf of intended IVF parents in the lawsuit who lost their embryos. I understood better than the average person just how awful that would feel. What I didn't realize first, though, was how much this outcome would mean for me personally. We have 3 embryos in Alabama, not 3 children. 1 in 5 pregnancies ends in a miscarriage, and there are all sorts of other ways embryos don't make it to a live birth. It has become even more clear to me after having 2 miscarriages. I see these embryos as a chance of having children. They are groups of cells. They cannot support themselves without being transferred into my uterus on exactly the right day of my cycle, when my body's been prepared to care for them and grow them. Embryos need tools, but now they've taken away our ability to give them tools to survive. We want to give these embryos a chance at life, and we are so ready for that. Our embryos are actually one of the things that have kept us in Alabama. We've talked about moving to one of our home states. Since we started this process here, we wanted to stay until we saw it through. Now we would consider leaving the state earlier than anticipated. If we need to move our embryos out of state, we'll also move our cells. I really do believe this will be one more contributor to brain drain out of Alabama because it won't be just us. Thank you for sharing. This is the next email. I know this is a long shot to share my story with you, but I too agree that the personal stories are powerful in helping people grasp the reality of the often scary term abortion. While I was not denied abortion care, my story is one of the more positive treatment stories. I've yet to become a mother to an Earthside baby, yet I hold out hope that the day will come for my husband and I. We are now hopeful to have a child via surrogacy. Oh, I so hope that for you too. My story is many years long, of course, but in an effort to keep this at a readable length, I'll summarize. We so desperately want to have a child and have pursued countless tests, surgeries, invasive scans, IUIs, IVF, and more. I've been pregnant 4 times, all of which have ended in different types of loss, all unbelievably life-altering in their own ways. In 2023, I was pregnant for the 3rd time and things were progressing well. The non-invasive prenatal testing came back low risk and normal. Every ultrasound was looking fine. We moved from our reproductive endocrinologist to my OBGYN and had a smooth sailing appointment. The doctor knew how nervous my husband and I both were and even went so far to ask, when can we feel safe? We're so nervous after all we've been through, and she was as encouraging as she could have been. At our first high-risk maternal fetal medicine appointment, our world came crashing down. The ultrasound tech was aggressively trying to find things on the screen that we could hardly understand. The grip on my husband's hand got tighter and tighter. With every passing second, I knew this was not good. When the doctor came in, she essentially kicked the tech out and grabbed my other hand and got real with me. It was an out-of-body experience that I relived 3 more times with different specialists in the coming days and week. I was pregnant with a baby we so very desperately wanted and worked hard for, spent a fortune on, if we're being honest, and options were wait for a likely 3rd trimester fetal demise, deliver a baby who will have a very short life filled with misery, or end this pregnancy as peacefully as possible for both my baby boy and for myself. We chose to terminate for medical reasons, TFMR, and I cannot begin to express how grateful I am that we chose to move from Texas to California 2 years prior to this nightmare experience. I was given the care I needed and deserved, as is every woman in America. It cannot be understated that this decision was hardly that. We knew. And while others may not have moved forward in the way that we did, no woman should be forced to subject themselves to a pregnancy of immense heartache and fear. The thought of waiting for what was described as a fetal demise was debilitating. All this to say, abortions are necessary for a plethora of reasons, all of which are personal, deeply emotional, and to be kept between a woman and medical professionals who should always be able to provide the care a patient requires. Thank you so much for sharing. And I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm trying not to comment. Oh, my heart breaks for you guys. I wish I could read every single word written in. I'm trying to pick things that represent different scenarios to kind of showcase how different everybody's life is, everybody's story. And some people write in with, stories of being treated compassionately, others not. And I just, wanted to, I guess, express most of all that blanketed laws can never address everybody's unique situations. This is just so personal and so different for everybody. And I think we don't even always understand the vast spectrum. And I just don't think we understand how, because of the stigma, how the term abortion has been stigmatized, like what this can look like for people. About 10 years ago, I volunteered in Chicago as a rape victim advocate, signing up for shifts to respond to area hospitals for when a survivor of sexual assault showed up to the emergency room. I would be their advocate to make sure they had someone explaining all of the medical and criminal legal processes that could unfold if they wanted. One of the hospitals that I frequented was a Catholic hospital on the northwest side of the city. One particular night, I'd been with a survivor and her boyfriend about 4 hours. The hospital was honestly really excellent about completing the evidence collection kits within a few hours, but the issue I was always bumping up against with the staff was about contraception, namely Plan B. She was adamant that she wanted Plan B because she wanted to ensure that there was no physical consequences pregnancy from this rape. The nurse was really resistant to ordering the medication and instead told the survivor she would have to have the doctor write a prescription for Plan B for the survivor to pick it up from the pharmacy on her way home. It was already about 4 a.m. at this point. The survivor said, absolutely not. I want to leave here, head directly home, and sleep as much of tomorrow as I can. The nurse huffed and then told the survivor she would order a urine test to determine if she was ovulating. If the survivor was ovulating, the nurse would urge the doctor to write the prescription since there would be a good chance the medication would work. It would do its job, preventing the unwanted pregnancy from a rape. And the nurse would use the science of testing the rape survivor's luteinizing hormone from her urine to back up the religious belief that Plan B is equivalent to an abortion, even in cases of rape. The survivor consented to having the urine test and we waited approximately 90 minutes. The nurse returned with other medications. Luckily, survivors get a whole slew of antibiotics as infectious disease prophylaxis. The survivor asked about the Plan B since it wasn't discussed. The nurse said that she actually lost the survivor's urine, so the test wasn't run, and the nurse actually had the prescription for Plan B from the doctor. At this point, it's 6 a.m. The survivor, her boyfriend, and I have been together in the emergency room for 6 hours. The survivor and I were understandably pissed. The survivor said, well, I will give you more urine for another test. I'm not leaving here without the medication. She turned to me and told me I was free to go since it would be another hour at least of waiting. I chose to say since I wanted the nurse to know that this was important to every person in that room. The survivor's boyfriend left to go get her something to drink from McDonald's so she could create another urine sample. Within a half hour, she handed off the urine to the nurse, and 90 minutes later, the doctor came into the room with Plan B for her to take and instructions on taking the second dose 12 hours later. He then said that she had been discharged and was free to go. It happened about 10 years ago, but it's seared into my memory as something I still can't understand. This woman had come to the hospital to start a process of evidence collection and reporting through the criminal legal system and trusted that these institutions would be fair and offer her a chance for justice and give back her some semblance of autonomy and physical safety. And yet the Catholic hospital used its own beliefs to determine what a care a woman could receive. Hi, if you're watching on video, I just changed outfits in rooms, but I was editing this back and realized in trying to get through stories and not provide my commentary, I didn't give context for why I read a Catholic hospital story. And I want to read another email from Beth, OBGYN, and a person that's done like clinical research on Catholic hospitals. So I'm not speaking out of turn because I know some of you have had very positive experiences at them, and it is a some, not all thing. And we just heard 2 stories that were differing examples because the first story we heard, she had a DNC at a Catholic hospital, it sounds like, because she talked about her discomfort with the priest and burial process, but also mentioned that she was given options at the onset. And the second story was 10 years ago, but was an example of how in a Catholic hospital, inexplicably, in a way that defies science and what we know to be true about Plan B, because Plan B is nowhere close to an abortion. Plan B it simply delays ovulation. It wouldn't allow an egg to fertilize. It's just scientifically not an abortion. It's preventing a pregnancy. It's the same issue with contraception. It's nuts that a person in that dramatic of a situation was made to wait that long and they weren't willing to give it at the hospital freely unless they first made sure she's not it's disgusting. The reason I wanted people to include Catholic hospital anecdotes is because forever, kind of under the radar, they're basically acting as a proxy for what states already do and will look like with more and more abortion restrictions, because Catholic hospitals are expected to follow what are called ERDs, ethical and religious directives for Catholic health services, which prohibit contraception, sterilization, abortion, most fertility treatments, and other services. However, the way these are implemented seemed, based on listener anecdotes alone, seemed to vary hospital to hospital. And many providers are motivated by patient needs, and they will develop and use workarounds in Catholic systems. And some hospital administrators and hospital leaders will endorse these workarounds, others not. I think why this kind of went under the radar, I didn't even understand that I had an abortion when my ectopic was medically terminated until I got a bill. I didn't even know to call it that. And Chrissy Teigen's kind of talked about this too. I don't think there was a lot of understanding that the exact same procedures and medications are used in induced abortions and miscarriage management or emergency pregnancy complication situations. And so I think when women were in Catholic hospitals, they maybe didn't even understand they were being given limited options. Because when I had my ectopic, I started receiving ads about an ethical remedy for an ectopic pregnancy. And I clicked on it. I was like, an ethical remedy? Like, what's ethical? You have to terminate. It's going to kill you. So, and I have a screenshot, July 3rd, 2021. I got an ad from the National Catholic Register. So they pay for people that I guess are Googling keywords about ectopic pregnancies, about abortions, to target people taking proper medical recourse when they have an unviable pregnancy. I was being targeted with ads about how I should feel like guilt and shame and repentance for being medically basically forced. I mean, I wasn't really given options. It wasn't, when I was in the ER, it wasn't, do you want to terminate this pregnancy? It was, how do you want to terminate this pregnancy? There is a 100% fatality rate with the location, and in terms of its unviability. And it would, have likely killed me had I let it get to that point unmanaged. I'm going to click on the ad that solicited this information. Is it morally acceptable to use the drug methotrexate to end an ectopic pregnancy? And then it goes on to say, direct abortion is never permissible, while the indirect taking of a life may be tolerated when all the requirements of the principle of double effect are satisfied. The matter of methotrexate therefore remains a question for individual conscience to resolve. That until such time there's an authoritative teaching on the question, meaning someone from the archdiocese is going to take their literal zero medical training and develop, and this is what lawmakers are doing. They're developing opinions based on moral mental gymnastics bullshit and not actual scientific evidence. A person in these circumstances should learn about the differing views on this issue held by theologians and ethicists whose work is in accord with the magisterium. Sorry, I'm not a born and raised Catholic. I'm just married one. And should then a decision in good conscience. So it's telling me to find my own ethical resolve and to consult a theologian over a physician and in terms of life-threatening health circumstance. I was shook. And anyways, basically it's telling you for a life-threatening health situation to contact a theologian to find, a solution for ethical resource when literally the clock is fucking ticking when you're in an emergency situation like that. It's honestly criminal. And beyond that, what I've learned from a lot of Beths when they had ectopics is that and many didn't even know that there would be other options at other hospitals, which I think is so fucked up because they were basically forced into surgery to get the tube removed, because to do the operation that directly targets the fetus or to be injected with methotrexate, which is what I was injected with, many Catholic hospitals won't do that because it directly targets the fetus, but they see the termination of the pregnancy as like a side effect or a supplementary outcome of the primary goal, which is removing the tube. So since you're not theoretically targeting the fetus itself, they do the moral mental gymnastics that surgery is okay as a means of resolving an ectopic, but many won't let you take a drug or do a surgery that targets the fetus specifically. Point being, I was shocked that Catholic hospitals, other Beths in my situation, have been subject to mental gymnastics bullshit of a religion they don't even practice. And think about how offensive that is. I, am culturally Christian and grew up Christian, but there are faiths where the preservation of the mother's life is the absolute most upheld virtue, the most upheld priority in these circumstances. And that would be directly going against their religious beliefs and their religious, I don't even understand how this is possible. But anyway, so that's how I found out about it. And I realized that until we started talking about this, many of you didn't even know that the set of options you were given were limited. But to reiterate why I'm telling you this, and I'll read an email from an actual doctor in a second, so this is not in vain. I'm not just always raging against religious institutions. the point of this is that in a circumstance where medical providers are held to a higher authority than evidence-based treatment options based on patient outcomes, whether you're held to the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops' standards for care, whether you're held to another religious authority, or you're held to law that makes you have to push women as close to being dead as possible to qualify for emergency care because those terms are so incredibly ambiguous. Providers in states restrict abortion laws, fear litigation, fear losing their license if they don't have the evidence to prove that patients are super almost dead in the event they have to intervene with abortion care. So it's like, it's conversation becomes hard because it's like people are saying emergency situations are being taken care of in states with strict abortion care. But the problem is like, mine was intervened before I was bleeding out, hemorrhaging, and near dying. But I could be pushed to that brink. If I can prove and document I was in a dire, literal emergency, and therefore they had to perform the abortion when medical best practice is known that that's an unviable pregnancy. And if a patient comes in early, they can treat it early and treat it early and less traumatically and less invasively. And it is vile and deeply unethical to me that in order to prevent litigation or to heed to religious beliefs that I don't even practice without the hospitals following it by a religious motivation for an underlying law or for having to defer to the religious authority under their hospital's ownership, we should all find it absolutely categorically unacceptable to push people as close to the point of death as possible to be able to intervene when there are known, proven, evidence-based treatment options for early intervention that can make the person suffer considerably less. But let me read an email from a Beth who wrote in, because every time I talk about this, people that have had emergency D&Cs or D&Es or have been given treatment options at Catholic hospitals are like, no, but I had a good experience. And that's amazing. But your good experience doesn't take away from other people's traumatic ones. And also, my point is not to never go to a Catholic hospital. My point is that, another Beth wrote in as a doctor saying that 1 in 6 hospital beds in the United States are Catholic owned. And while I'm grateful for the health and medical services that have been historically funded and led by the Catholic Church, I think that it's incredibly important to be knowledgeable about this if you are pregnant or considering having a child, and not telling you to never go to a Catholic hospital. My point is to choose an OB, to choose the hospital where you give birth, and to have a conversation beforehand and be crystal clear. In the event of XYZ emergency, in the event of XYZ pregnancy complications, what options do you provide? So just look up the hospital's religious affiliation. It could be Catholic, it could be Protestant, and ask if your treatment options will be dictated by medical evidence and medical best practice based on known patient outcomes, or if your treatment options are ultimately held to the authority of what Catholic ERGs or some other religiously affiliated authority, and express your discomfort with having your medical decisions be made by church and not science. So let me read this email from Beth. She said, I'll start with my credentials. I'm a reproductive health researcher at the only non-religious health system in my city, which sits in a red-blue state border. And she sent me a list of all the papers she's published in medical journals, and several of which focus on the provision of abortion care. The whole thing about Catholic hospitals and other religiously affiliated hospitals and provision of reproductive care is super interesting. One of my favorite examples is how it impacts the management of a spontaneous abortion, i.e. miscarriage, or fetal demise, i.e. stillbirth. The different Catholic directives are focused on prohibition of abortion, but the same procedures are used to manage losses. The problem with Catholic hospitals is that the doctors there perform D&Cs and D&Es so rarely that when an emergent situation or a loss comes up, they often have to transfer to other hospitals anyways, because they aren't comfortable doing the procedures. Ultimately, that's the right decision for the patient, because it's much safer to have your doctor be someone who routinely does the procedure versus someone who may fumble through it once every 2 to 3 years. This is coming from a doctor. We surveyed 350 OBGYNs nationwide before the Dobbs decision, asking about what options they provided for managing early pregnancy loss. There's lots of options, but two evidence-based ones we are less likely to see in Catholic hospitals include providing mifepristone. They don't like that it's also used in medication abortions, so they often don't keep it in the hospital, or office-based uterine aspiration, much less expensive than taking a patient to the OR, but the providers aren't comfortable with it in that setting. We found that institutions supportive of abortion care were nearly 4 times more likely to providing comprehensive options to manage early pregnancy loss. And I love this. She sent me the adjusted odds ratio, 3.91 with a 95% confidence interval. Yes, I'm a STEM girly. And I actually do love a confidence interval from my BPI days. And she said, guess which institutions were significantly less likely to be supportive of abortion? Catholic ones, 88% less likely to be supportive of it, in fact. And she gave me the stats in the confidence interval and attached a published paper. We're about to do a study in interviewing OBGYNs at Catholic hospitals and other religiously affiliated institutions to see how the landscape has changed post-ops for what they offer for early pregnancy loss. There's definitely a difference between Catholic hospitals and other affiliations. And she goes on to say, what I think a lot of people still don't understand is how it's not just about induced abortion. There's still a huge trickle-down effect, and it can impact so many areas of reproductive care. Anyways, so I just wanted you to know that I'm not talking out of my ass and just trying to make the Catholic hospitals look bad. I just don't know if the risk is worth it. And I also don't want to scare people who are like have an OB there, about to give birth there, whatever. Like, just have a conversation about what your expectations are for care. Just a heads up. And again, like, this is going to seem all over the place, but I just wanted different anecdotes from different points across the vast spectrum of reproductive care to kind of show that this can affect all types of people in all different circumstances. And anyways, here's the next story. After about a year of trying to get pregnant, I was referred to a fertility clinic. Having been on birth control since I was 15, I was anxious when I couldn't conceive. At 32, I was diagnosed with PCOS, and after spending about $8,000 on medications to help us conceive, we had no luck. So we decided to try IVF, taking out a $30,000 loan and enduring a roller coaster of pills, injections, and endless appointments. And after all that, we had 3 viable embryos, and we opted to have them genetically tested. 2 were healthy, while the third was inconclusive. Not enough cells were taken to determine viability. Yeah, that's called mosaic, I think, right? Starting with our 2 healthy embryos, we tried the first, thankfully, which resulted in a child. A couple years later, we tried the second, another successful pregnancy, though it came at an additional cost of $10,000. Altogether, our fertility journey set us back around $50,000, a debt we're still chipping away at. Then a few years later, despite everything, I got pregnant naturally. I didn't realize until I was already 9 weeks along, far past my state's 6-week abortion ban. Timing added an extra layer of complexity. The same day I found out I was pregnant, we got the news that one of our kids had a rare genetic disorder. It was a lot to process. With 2 kids facing unique special needs challenges, my partner and I wondered if we could take on more. My OB recommended an amniocentesis to check for any issues given our situation. My OB, who'd been with me through all my pregnancies, warned me that if the results revealed a serious issue, I'd have to travel out of state for any intervention or termination, that their offices would provide us resources to get out of state into a clinic safely. I sat there in shock. I'm pro-choice, and though I'd never imagined I'd personally face this decision, I now understand how critical it is for everyone to have this option. As a white woman with the resources to travel, I know my position is privileged, which makes this feel even more unjust. I was hanging on by a thread to keep it all together. How are others expected to bear this burden financially, emotionally, and mentally? With elections around the corner, I'm left with 1 frozen embryo still on ice and questions about what lies ahead. During IVF, we signed document after document about our embryos, agreeing to donate any unused ones to science. But now I wonder, will we be forced to carry that embryo, pressured to giving it away, or punished if we don't use it? And what about all the frozen eggs I have on ice as well? And to add to everything, the third pregnancy came with severe complications in my 2nd trimester, and at points both my life and my unborn child's were at risk. Although I wasn't in a religious hospital, I still worried. What if they decided to keep me pregnant until I reached a life-threatening point? That I even had this fear is mind-boggling. After everything, years of fertility treatments, the ups and downs of pregnancy, managing genetic disorders, my conviction is only strengthened. Every family deserves the right to make their own choices about their health, futures, and lives. These are intensely personal, often agonizingly difficult and complex decisions. The fact that this is even a debate makes my blood boil. Not sure if this is the kind of story you were looking for, but I don't think people truly realize how complicated fertility, pregnancy, and even birth can be. It's so different for every woman and for every family. So for the government to issue one blanket statement over everyone's bodies is so unjust. Love you in the pod. Love you. Thanks for writing in. This is about IVF. I inherited a chromosome condition from my mom and have known my whole life that I would need fertility care. My health is not impacted by the condition, but it leads to about 80% of my eggs not having the right chromosomal makeup. The options are basically expectation management and have multiple losses, for me specifically likely late-term loss, or IVF with PGT testing. Because of Dobbs, my husband and I started IVF earlier than we initially thought we would. We live in a red state, which the legislature has tried to pass personhood bills. We were nervous. We did our first round in July 2022. Over the next 2 years, we did a total of 7 retrieval cycles. 86% of the embryos we sent for testing were impacted by my chromosome condition and would not have survived. I think about if I didn't have the option to test these embryos, how many losses I would have had, how my life would be at risk every time I got pregnant, how in my state I would have likely had to travel for care by the time I knew if the fetus had the correct chromosomes or not. We finally have 4 viable embryos. As we start to plan for our first transfer, I am terrified I will lose my right to use my own embryos that I worked so hard to create. I'm worried that if something happens, even with a tested embryo, that I will have to travel for the care I need. Nebraska has 2 ballot measures, one to protect abortion rights and one to enshrine the current ban into the Constitution and give way for future restriction, likely on IVF. I helped collect signatures to get the protection on the ballot and have served on committees to help spread the word. I hate that I have to share my own personal connection in order to get people to care, but I feel like I'm doing everything I can to keep my rights and potential children's rights safe. There is a good chance that one of these embryos will inherit my condition. I feel like I need to fight for myself and for their option to have the same testing resources I did. Thank you for sharing. I'm sharing my IVF story to show how restrictions to IVF, which is the end goal, will make my daughter's very existence impossible. I promise I'm trying to be brief, but it's very challenging because IVF is so complex, so please bear with me. We already know that the far right and religious extremists want to define life at conception. Through this, IVF will be legally inaccessible. Clinics will close and doctors will be afraid to practice IVF as it is currently practiced for fear of prosecution or litigation if an embryo is considered a person. I know you've posted and spoken about this at length, and I trust your guests will also talk about this and break it down for your listeners. Many on the extreme side say, well, we agree with IVF, we don't want it to be illegal, but there has to be some restrictions, like reducing the number of embryos allowed to be made. Here's how that impacts people like me. Over the course of 3 years, my husband and I experienced 2 miscarriages, 3 full rounds of IVF, each time only getting 1 viable embryo, 2 embryo transfers, and 1 surgery for endometriosis after my 2 miscarriages and 2 failed transfers and 3 fertility doctors. We took a full 14 months off from treatment because my mental health was in the toilet at that point, and I had exploratory endometriosis surgery. Turns out I had silent endo that was the root cause of all my cycles. After this break, surgery, switching clinics, and getting a third opinion from an endometriosis specialist with a 6-month wait list that wasn't covered by insurance, I finally had a successful embryo transfer in March 2023 that resulted in the birth of my daughter in late 2023. One of the things these extremists and people like Trump want to impose are restrictions on the amount of eggs allowed to be fertilized. If that were the law, people like me and thousands of others would be impacted by this. My daughter simply would not exist. This is not speculation, it's a fact. Each round of IVF for us resulted in a decent amount of eggs, but very mature eggs and very few embryos. Same. People who don't understand the intricacies of IVF have no business having an opinion about it, or even worse, passing laws on it. Even more, most infertility patients have unexplained infertility. The reason is that most people actually do have an underlying diagnosis, but it takes time and money to get it, and many people never do. For me, I had silent endometriosis, meaning I had no symptoms, but I actually had stage 2 endo. For many people, fertility is the only symptom of endometriosis. The only true way to diagnose it is via surgery, which is expensive and invasive, so many people don't go this route. Okay, here are my key egg retrieval fertilization results below. Round 1, 10 eggs, 3 mature, 2 fertilized, 1 blastocyst. This one was genetically tested to be normal. She did a frozen transfer 2 months later that was unsuccessful. Round 2, 13 eggs, 11 mature, 4 fertilized to day 3. Day 3, fresh transfer unsuccessful. From the remaining 3 embryos that were fertilized, only 1 made it to the blastocyst stage. This one was genetically tested as normal and we froze it for 1.5 years. This special embryo ended up being our daughter. Round 3, 16 eggs, 14 mature, 11 fertilized, 4 blastocysts, 1 genetically normal, 1 low-level mosaic, and 2 abnormal. We froze all of them, but we discarded the 2 abnormal embryos. We donated them to science after the Alabama case. We switched clinics later on, and our new clinic doesn't even accept abnormal embryos transferred from other clinics. We still have 1 normal and 1 low-level mosaic embryo frozen. We hope to have 1 more living child and hope that these 2 remaining embryos give us a chance. Now that we know my diagnosis, and after 3 tries, we finally found a protocol that works. However, there's no guarantee. So these results from me, a real person who went to hell and back for my baby. Let's say that the government now says doctors can only fertilize 2 eggs and only fresh transfers are allowed. With that type of law or restriction, the chances of us having a pregnancy or live birth are slim to none. The people who throw out these ideas have no idea how this works. My 3rd round of IVF, 14 eggs were mature. All of them were attempted to be fertilized, sperm injected into the egg. And from that, we only got 4 embryos, and 2 of them were incompatible with life. If only 2 were allowed to be fertilized, the chances of those becoming an embryo are very likely. I had, in my first retrieval, one time I had 20-some eggs, and the other time I had 30-some. Like the first time, all of those eggs only ended because there weren't very many mature, because I had egg quality issues, I guess. We only got 2 embryos, which statistically is 1 live birth. If they had to arbitrarily select some of those eggs, it just dwindles your chances even more. It makes the expenses even more dire to grasp. It was unbelievable to me. It was described like March Madness, the process of IVF, of how it dwindles down from eggs to mature eggs to fertilized to making it to the blastocyst phase to making it through genetic testing. And I can't believe, you go from 20 or 30 something eggs down to 2, and those 2 embryos statistically only are likely to yield 1 live birth, since not all transfers succeed because, again, embryos are not people. Yeah, people really, I really wouldn't have understood it unless I went through it as well, and it just makes the immense complexity and chance of human conception all the more real and puzzling. And then she said, and let's say that at day 3, fresh transfers are required, like Italy's former laws, and 2 embryos are required to be transferred. On the one hand, ASRM no longer recommends transferring more than 1 because it decreases chances for success and increases risks for complications. On the other hand, let's say those embryos do implant, now you have a twin pregnancy, which is always high risk. And then let's say the embryos split and you have triplets or quadruplets. In a country with a potential abortion ban with an increasing infant mortality rate and the highest maternal mortality rate in the developed world, this spells disaster, trauma, and a death sentence for many women and families. We are already seeing patients like the woman in Texas who had to do selective reduction on one of her twins because she was at risk of losing both babies and her own life was at risk too. This is just horrific and terrifying. If you read up on Italy, please read the attached op-ed. It's eye-opening. You'll learn that after about a decade, they finally overturned this law because it was so incredibly damaging. If the damage had been done long-term, this is what these politicians want to do. At the end of the day, rich people will always be able to do IVF and rich people will always be able to get abortions. It's the average and the middle-class people like me who will be impacted the most. It is devastating and terrifying, and I can't imagine living in a world where my daughter's existence is illegal. We always planned to be very open with her about how much we wanted her in our IVF journey to get her. I don't know what that looks like in a world where her life is a potential Supreme Court case. She attached another article. Sorry, there are a bunch of links. I'm just trying to get through emails. It's not an opinion or a speculation piece. It's fact. The people who were behind the movement to overturn Roe are directly quoted in here saying how they plan to restrict IVF, similar to Italy's old laws, which were horrific and significantly lowered success rates and increased risks. For example, requiring 3 embryos to be transferred at once because freezing embryos was illegal. Only fresh transfers allowed. No PGT testing, etc. In closing, I want to share that I come from a religious and conservative family. Every member of my parents' generation and older in my family has voted and plans to vote again for Trump, even now. My own family doesn't listen to me, and they don't believe anything will happen to IVF because of Trump's absolute lies that he's told. It's infuriating and deeply upsetting. I try to break it down for them, and they just don't believe me. I was raised Catholic, but have absolutely nothing to do with the church for many reasons. During my pregnancy, I made my husband promise to never bring me to a Catholic hospital if something were to happen. I also refused to have my daughter baptized, especially in a church, because they have a strong stance against IVF, and it's literally on their website and is filled with misinformation. Same. People like me who have a loving family, even though they're all Trump supporters, can't even convince my own child's grandparents of the legitimate risks to the future of IVF. I don't have a lot of hope, to be totally candid, but I'm hoping that your episode can really break this down, and I will share it with anyone who will listen. Well, I'm sorry if this episode's too broad. I really just I can't deep dive every individual issue, and that's not really my place or core content, but I wanted to at least talk about it broad strokes if I could, bring in an expert and share this spectrum of situations women are in this country that aren't represented by the extremes. And I so appreciate all the detail you shared with me, and I hope I can do a semblance of justice, even if it can't be comprehensive. Thank you for sharing. I was diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer in 2020 at age 28. One of the first things my doctor said was I needed to think about freezing my eggs before chemo. This was July 7th and chemo was August 13th. I pretty much needed to make a decision that day since we were in a time crunch. I decided to go through the egg retrieval process and ended up freezing 11 eggs less than a week before beginning chemo. I'm still undergoing some treatments, but I'm happy to say that I'm 3.5 years cancer-free. Oh, I'm so glad. I'm not in a place medically or personally where I've been able to go through IVF, but I am also lesbian, so this adds another layer to my story. Every year it passes gets scarier and scarier as we're not only losing reproductive rights, but gay rights as well. I live in Indiana, which is a state that has a total abortion ban right now. We only have 3 exceptions to this law. I would have never thought when I underwent my procedure back in 2020 that our country would be in the scary place it is right now. I've always wanted to be a mom, and I was naive and privileged enough to believe that we would just continue to get more rights as time went on. Come to Illinois, it's not too far. We can be friends. I have 2 beautiful girls because of IVF and a DNC. When we were trying for our second after 3 brutal egg retrievals and a pregnancy loss, we were finally pregnant again with our second embryo transfer. Unfortunately, at our ultrasound, there was no heartbeat. I took medicine to pass the miscarriage at home and lost so much blood over 2 traumatic days. Think golf ball-sized blood clots, and my medical team was sure it was over. Much to our collective surprise, it wasn't, and my body was clinging to the unviable pregnancy. Despite that trauma and grief, I was lucky to be able to schedule a DNC nearly 2 weeks after that horrible ultrasound. Accessing a D&C was not only the compassionate choice, but a necessary choice because my body would not release the pregnancy. A year later, and after 4 embryo transfers, we had our second baby. I never envisioned IVF and a D&C for myself, but I'm truly grateful that I could access this medical care and bring 2 wonderful and miraculous girls into this world. Thank you for sharing. I live in Alabama, where I can confidently say and show how the war on IVF is still alive and well. My husband was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer at age 29 in August 2021. At one point, the doctors told us he had a 6% chance of survival. At that point, all dreams of having a family were put on the back burner as he fought for his life. I'm happy to say, oh my gosh, I'm so excited that he's now cancer-free after the amazing care and surgical team at MD Anderson. And we're so thankful every day. Can't handle this, you guys. I'm so glad. This is good. I was worried. We immediately knew we wanted to start a family, as we always dreamed of being parents. We felt we had lost so much time and we wanted to explore options as quickly as possible. Because of his aggressive chemotherapy regimen and other factors, we were told IVF was our best shot at starting a family using the sperm he banked prior to beginning chemo. I underwent 2 egg retrievals, one in August 2023 and one in December 2023. Both were very difficult on my body. We were lucky to have 5 PGT normal embryos, PGT's genetic testing. After these retrievals, we planned for a frozen embryo transfer in early 2024, and then the Alabama Supreme Court decision came down, which effectively shut clinics down until liability could be assessed for clinics and doctors. Ultimately, the clinics did reopen, but not without serious changes to their policies and procedures, limiting their ability to provide the full spectrum care they previously had. We went on to have 2 failed frozen embryo transfers. This is why embryos aren't people. Is this now the 3rd person that's talked about having a failed transfer? Nobody knows. I've said it once, I'll say it again. Nobody understands more than people undergoing IVF that embryos are not children. They wish more than anything they would be, but they are not. We went on to have 2 failed frozen embryo transfers, one in March and one in June. We discovered our doctors had made several bad decisions with protocols and our standard of care and decided it would be best to change to another clinic. We went into the appointment with our new doctor so hopeful. She was amazing and is fighting on the forefront for IVF access and reproductive rights in Alabama. Our hope was quickly shattered when we discovered that due to the liability implications from the previous Alabama Supreme Court decision, our new clinic could not accept any embryos from other clinics. At that point, we were given the option to discard those embryos and start all over with the new clinic, or be referred to clinic out of state to move our embryos and to provide care for our future embryo transfers. We have waited months to get in with the new doctor out of state, and to this day still have not had our appointment. We continue to be in limbo as each day passes slower than the last one as we continue to dream of being parents. I understand how you feel. Because of this court ruling here in Alabama, which continues to be spun by the Republican Party as something they have fixed or intend to fix, my access to care is limited. We have to pay thousands of dollars to transport embryos, putting them also at risk. All of this after spending so much time and money over the last 2 years, and honestly losing all hope in humanity in the process. Clinics are scared and physicians are scared, and I am scared. I hope that our story may show people that although the right is feeling that they support IVF and are pro-family, they haven't done anything to help families in situations like ours. And I think these issues have resolved or will be resolved with whatever pro-family plan they plan to implement. This couldn't be further from the truth. So many continue to be impacted and will only get worse if women's rights are further restricted. I want to share my story. This one says, I want to share my story about abortion access because I think women in blue states maybe think they are safe. And of course, we should care about women in red states, but also it impacts us. I live in Michigan. In fall of 2022, we enshrined abortion access into our state constitution. However, after Roe was overturned, I had a missed or incomplete miscarriage. I needed a D&C, but my care was delayed because women in states like Ohio are coming to Michigan because they cannot get care in their own state. I cannot emphasize enough how much it matters that we all have the same rights. I ended up waiting a week for my D&C knowing I had dead fetal tissue inside me, and it was agonizing and torture, and I cannot imagine the pain of women carrying a baby to term. Every day I wait, I risked infection, etc. Thank you for sharing these stories. Wish I didn't have to. But thank you for sharing with me. I unfortunately suffered a second pregnancy loss last week. My 9-week ultrasound, I found out my pregnancy stopped growing at 6 weeks. My OBGYN told me they couldn't provide any miscarriage management without a second ultrasound in 11 days to prove the fetus was not viable. I live in South Carolina, and because of the heartbeat bill, I couldn't get any treatment. I ended up flying out of state the next day for a D&C in Virginia. I would have risked my health by continuing to carry dead fetal tissue for 11 days, then find out if I could receive an abortion. I couldn't wait 11 days to go through the physical, mental, and emotional agony of whether I'd miscarry on my own or develop an infection. I have a 2.5-year-old daughter, and in order for me to be able to take care of her, I needed to take care of myself first. I know I'm fortunate that I had the means to travel out of state, but I'm so infuriated that I had to do so. I'm in my 4th and final year of OBGYN training residency in the state of Tennessee. The aftershocks of Dobbs are devastating. though I firmly believe that not wanting to be pregnant is reason enough to have an abortion. The stories about patients denied access for a medical indication draw the most sympathy. What I have to say is that everyone thinks it won't happen to them. They think abortion laws don't apply because they would never do that. And that couldn't be further from the truth. Everyone with a uterus and ovaries has the capacity to experience a life-threatening complication from a pregnancy they planned and wanted. Dozens of patients are shocked to hear that their specific situation is not an exemption to Tennessee's abortion ban. Now we have to wait until their life is in some degree of more immediate danger, so vague, to call our hospital lawyers and make sure terminating a pregnancy is acceptable. I've had patients accuse me of experimenting with their life by not doing an abortion when it was medically indicated, when in reality it's not me who's experimenting, but the politicians who wrote this archaic legislation. At the end of the day, none of this is anyone's damn business except the patients and their doctors. Thank you for caring about abortion. Thank you for writing. It's helpful to hear from providers too. I live in Kansas City, Missouri, and I was pregnant with my fourth child in early 2021 and started bleeding at 11 weeks. I saw my OBGYN that day and she confirmed that I was miscarrying and sent me home with instructions to come back in if I was bleeding particularly heavily. The medical term is called expectant management, which is doctor for let's see how it goes. Late that evening, I started bleeding a lot, so much that I had my husband bring me to the ER. This was still COVID protocol days, so he couldn't even come with me. I hung out and bled profusely in the ER for the next 6 hours. The doctor swore that everything was fine and that this is just how miscarriages go sometimes. At one point, my blood pressure was so low that I started throwing up and thought I would pass out. Things didn't feel right, so I called my good friend who happens to be an OBGYN attending doctor in another state. She advised that women are great at overcompensating, so vitals look great until they don't and things go downhill fast. She also advised that I was not getting proper care. Mind you, the on-call OB didn't bother to actually come in, and I was just communicating with the ER doc over the phone that I should leave and go to a university-related hospital where an OB would be on site. Luckily, the University of Kansas hospital is only about 30 minutes from me, so I checked myself out, and my husband drove the 30 minutes while I was bleeding all over myself and still puking. When I arrived at KU Hospital, I was almost immediately offered a DNC and underwent the procedure about an hour later. Abortion is constitutionally protected in Kansas, while Missouri has one of the most restrictive abortion laws in the country. I truly don't know how everything would have turned out if I didn't have the ability to cross state lines for proper medical care. Maybe I would have been fine. Maybe I would have died and left my other 3 children without a mother. I'd also like to add that I'm a practicing Catholic. My children go to Catholic school, and I consider myself pro-life. Mind you, I am adamantly against the death penalty, which is conveniently left out of many pro-life conversations. All that being said, I can't wait to vote next week on Amendment 3 in Missouri to codify the right to abortion, among other reproductive rights, in the Missouri Constitution. While my story is not one of pregnancy or loss, it's still relevant to reproductive rights. I have lived with epilepsy since I was 14 years old. I have known since diagnosis pregnancy may be impossible for me due to the risks. Also, many anti-epileptic drugs are unsafe in pregnancy, some even causing severe birth defects. I was on one of those drugs for the past 19 years until it became no longer effective for treating my seizures. In the spring, testing confirmed that I was having up to 56 breakthrough seizures a day, and my quality of life was being affected. However, when considering alternative medication, my neurologist kept pressing me on if I wanted children, wanted to be pregnant, and even consulted my husband who was in the room, and was going to choose a drug solely based on those answers. Not a drug that would be the most effective for me, a living, breathing person in front of them, but a drug that would be safer for a maybe baby. After feeling defeated and reduced to my reproductive organs, I answer with, I do not know if I want to be pregnant, but I do know I want to be well. When I left the office, I do not know if I've ever felt so small or insignificant as I did when my livelihood was on the line. Many people do not understand how these laws trickle into healthcare, even when a high-risk pregnancy is just a mere possibility. So true. Thank you for sharing. That's a really good point. I live in Utah and I have a couple of children that I adore. They are perfect. My life is complete, etc., etc. However, I do not want another child. Other than limited financial resources, we don't live near family. Raising a child between my husband, myself, and the public school system is so hard. I'm back in school myself, pursuing an engineering career that I never thought I was qualified to do because I was a woman. Yay, Idaho Mormonism. She told me to skip to the next set of brackets. I'm looking for them. Oh, I guess her condom failed and suddenly she was pregnant. I didn't find out until I was close to 10 weeks pregnant because it simply wasn't on my radar. I have an irregular period. And initially we decided to keep the child. I stupidly told my family. And as I was coming to terms with derailing my career progression again, we realized that I needed to start making money in the next few years to be able to afford futures for the 2 kids we already had. We were also just beginning the magical years of early childhood. I wanted to enjoy the time I was going to have with them at such a beautiful stage in life without having to cancel museum trips because of naps or cut down on our already meager extracurriculars just by being too tired to appreciate it. Religious me would have thought these were all bad excuses to, in quotes, kill. And I guess when you're framing it that way, maybe not. But something switched in me where I realized I literally could not handle having this extra child without carrying resentment possibly for the rest of my living, feeling children didn't do anything to deserve it. I called my OB. She wouldn't perform an abortion. Too risky in Utah. I called a center sort of like Planned Parenthood. I was told I better get in quick so I don't miss any cutoffs. And by the way, Utah has a waiting period. The earliest the law would let me come in was Friday, and appointments were full. I had to keep calling back, hoping someone would cancel because this was the only place in my state I could find willing to do an elective abortion. Fortunately, an appointment opened up right before closing on Friday. When they did the ultrasound to confirm pregnancy, there was no heartbeat. I was so grateful they could perform a surgical abortion right then and there, and I didn't have to bleed it out over the weekend. The procedure itself was nearly painless. The recovery was short, unlike my friends, who miscarried and the doctor refused to perform a surgical abortion, even though after a week of excessive bleeding, tissue was still stuck in her uterus. He said he was helping her out because surgical abortions, in his view, made having a future more difficult. I don't know if that's true, but he put her ability to maybe have an easier time having a future child over her health and life. I find my experience a good test for the morality of an abortion. I went into the abortion center purely for what conservative me would have dubbed frivolous reasons to kill a child, but when the fetus was already no longer living, the exact same procedure, by many religious people's accounts, was fine. My intent never changed, though. But am I a bad person because I still would have followed through if there was a heartbeat? I am still in my engineering classes, getting a 4.0 GPA, advanced calculus and engineering classes, working on a research group to find more accurate ways to detect different cancers in women. My mom believes we'll cure cancer. LOL. Not that simple, Mom. That's sweet, though. What she doesn't know and will probably never know is that the abortion I got is what kept me going to school and kept me healthy. I simply could not do this with another child to care for. It's hard enough to do it with the angelically energetic two I already have. I really want to have a debate on ethics with her, but I won't, so I'm not branded a would-be murderer. I'm still debating telling my sister because she had a condom-hating husband bound to have more children than she can care for, but I fear it would be too big of a secret for her to bear, so I'll tell you. Oh. I have no regrets and will do it again. But my husband was so struck hard by the fear of God that he was motivated to get sniped within the month, and he said he would do it again yearly to have a weekend where he could just lay in bed and play video games. LOL, men's reproductive pains feel too easy at times. Anyway, thanks for reading. I was pregnant for the first time in 2022. From my very first ultrasound at 8 weeks, there were early indicators that something was genetically wrong with my baby. The next ultrasound was even clearer that there was a genetic abnormality. While my amazing OBGYN kept her cool, she impressed upon me the importance of getting more tests as quickly as possible, because the process took a lot of time, and in her very diplomatic and kind doctor way, it was clear to me what she was implying. I may not have the luxury of time for a lot of reasons. I think it's around the 20 to 22 week mark in Kansas where you can get an abortion, and there was a very real position that this could change to be a smaller window very soon. While we waited for our genetic test results to see how severe the situation would be, 3 things happened. I attended my then husband's uncle's funeral, then his father's funeral, and then the red state of Kansas was voting on abortion rights. I was on the brink of having to make a decision I hoped I'd never have to make. This was very much a wanted pregnancy, but I wasn't going to proceed if my life were at risk or if the baby was unlikely to survive or have any quality of life. When I arrived to his uncle's funeral at a Catholic church, the lobby was full of political signs and pamphlets advocating for people to vote to restrict my right to health care. I immediately was filled with panic and couldn't hold it together. People looked at me funny because they knew I didn't know the deceased well, but I was crying like he was my father. They didn't know about what I was going through. The church is supposed to be a safe place, but I felt the opposite. I didn't stay. I needed to leave. When my ex's very Catholic father passed, I braced myself because I knew I had to stay for the whole service, even though there were signs all over every public space, except the sanctuary. Thankfully, the voters of Kansas upheld my rights and my daughter's genetic issues turned out to be very manageable. She's healthy and thriving. I'm thankful that my story turned out well, but the real and immediate consequences were both traumatizing and motivating. Motivating only because I knew this was a bigger battle that I would fight, so other women who were faced with the most heartbreaking choice have the freedom and privacy to make the best choice with the advice of their doctor and no one else. Traumatizing because friends, family, coworkers, and neighbors were actively campaigning to take away my rights and make an unbearable situation for me infinitely worse. The day after the vote, I had scheduled an appointment with my OB and wore my RBG necklace. The nurse cried tears of joy with me, and she told me if she ever got pregnant, it would be life-threatening. The doctor shed a single tear as I wept tears of relief, and she told me she couldn't work in her line of work and support any part of the ban. She knows how deep and complex abortion is to women and their care teams and how this would only do harm to everyone involved. Thank you for sharing. How long have I... Oh my God, I have so many more. Guys, I feel so badly. If I didn't read your story, it's not because I didn't want to. I wanted to be so careful to maintain anonymity that Courtney made them into a Word doc for me and kind of made them alternate by topic. And I wanted to get through as many as I could, but I didn't go through the email inbox I don't know, in case I accidentally said something, because sometimes you guys write personal stuff, then the story, then personal stuff. And I was like not wanting to read anything by accident that would like indicate who you were or any personal info. I didn't want to see your name attached to it. So that's why if you're like, why wouldn't she reply to this heart-wrenching email? It's because I was just trying to read the anonymized information and not make any mistakes because, unfortunately, in some places, this is criminal, and I just wanted to be incredibly careful. But like, I'm just so grateful to those of you who took the time, and I know this probably was excruciating for a lot of you, and I think that there were a lot of interesting examples of how reproductive freedom is so essential, of how variable the circumstances are that exist within, in the process of trying to get pregnant, IVF or otherwise, wanting to be pregnant or not wanting to be pregnant, desperately wanting a baby that has, with a dire prognosis that is anticipated to have fetal demise, that has genetic issues that drastically impact the quality of life, and how heart-wrenching TFMR situations can be. My topic was, I think, technically was a termination for medical reasons. And I think about it every day. And yeah, again, the purpose wasn't to bum you out, but to kind of talk through how this issue just isn't as black and white as people present it, to kind of explain that, when people call this a single issue and we're talking about our lives, our futures, our families, it's the farthest thing from a frivolous single issue. And beyond that, I'm grateful to Dr. Jeelani, whose time is incredibly valuable, and she took the time to come here and explain to us the science of personhood, how it's viewed in the fertility community, and how these laws could or could not realistically, impact patients going forward and their ability to provide a certain standard of care. I know a lot of you are in this phase of trying to figure out what's next for your families and for your fertility. And it's like, I don't want to scare anybody, but I also think there are some times where we should be scared because what's happened is scary. And the scary part is people writing laws about a topic they know nothing about that is so incredibly nuanced. And I just thought maybe if we could explain some of these nuances in all circumstances related to abortion, and then connect how abortion care is related to IVF, that it might help someone, but I don't know if it did. And anyway, guys, thanks for listening to this bonus episode. It meant a lot to me. I don't know if I need a glass of wine or if I need a hug, if I want to scream or what, but I'm sure this was an emotional roller coaster for you listening to. And I'm sorry I'm ending on a note of like, I don't know how to feel, but I hope at least there's some solidarity in knowing like these precarious years of trying to figure out if you do or don't want kids, if you can or can't have kids, and the many scenarios that exist with carrying a healthy baby to term. Like, you hear so many stories that are just so beautiful and picture perfect, and it seems like people have no problems. But the thing is, so many things can happen. So many things do happen, and they're often harbored as secrets or shared with whispers or carried with some sort of shame. And I know it can be so complicated to entrust people in our immediate lives with these things, especially because there's so many different viewpoints and so much involved that shouldn't be in how people moralize and stigmatize these situations. But I appreciate you telling me. I got cut off, so I'm back recording in a different room. No, I appreciate you telling me and trusting me, and I appreciate you trusting this audience. I kind of was trying to put this together down to the wire because I just never know if this type of thing is helpful or so triggering, or I'm just stating the obvious, or if it's educational. It's hard for me to know, but I figured there's no harm in trying, and we'll make it a bonus, and I'm not going to monetize it. And honestly, I've thought long and hard about like getting formally involved, like as a public person with, organizations or political parties in a deeper way that would risk people questioning my credibility because I care so much about this topic. I'm not a plant. I'm not funded. I don't work for any sort of political organization that's incentivizing me to talk about this stuff or share this stuff. Believe it or not, I'm not even really here as like a Democrat, but as a person that like worries that people don't know what they're voting for, and worries about other women who I know care deeply about the health and safety of the women in their lives, the options and care that will be available when they choose to expand their future families. And I care deeply about anybody at any point in their life making the very valid choice that they are not ready to become a parent. The point is never to suggest that some circumstances are more justifiable than others, rather to explore the variability, because I think certain anecdotes really strike a chord with some people more than others. And some things help people metabolize information when they can relate to it or they know somebody that's been in that circumstance. And anyways, I don't know. I should wrap up because this is already too long and at risk of people not listening to the whole thing. But thank you so much to Kindbody for being willing to participate, even though it's important for them to be unbiased. I warned them that this was going to be in an episode with my broader bias, but I just want to reiterate that their opinions aren't mine. But I thought their commentary was incredibly important because I know a lot of you are incredibly worried about the state of IVF going forward. I especially appreciate you being here. If you were new or not necessarily as open to hearing this side of things, it's not all encompassing by any stretch, but these are real people and real listeners who were incredibly generous and vulnerable and letting their stories be shared in a public way like this. And I just ask that you respect that. When I went on book tour, when I do track 5, when I do anything in person with listeners, it's so interesting because, the things we talk about most on here, like influencers and Taylor Swift and Mormon bloggers, and like there's so many through lines throughout this podcast. But as I approached the period of my life where I was considering expanding my family and I kind of slowly opened up about it on here, it also became a common topic of this podcast and a reason a lot of people found it. And more so than anything, when I meet people in person, this is what they talk to me about. These things are so, so personal. And sometimes they're so personal you can't even talk to people in your immediate life about it. Some of the people that wrote in emails, like their loved ones don't even know about their experience. It sometimes can be the hardest thing of all to open up to the people closest to us when there's political differences, when there's not a lot of understanding of the nuances, and when it's just excruciating to have to justify yourself or your choices to a person that's not willing to understand and is going out of their way to misunderstand oftentimes. And I've experienced that myself firsthand. And that's kind of the power and intimacy of a medium like this, is finding information, solace and solidarity in strangers when things are so personal and private. And I just am, endlessly grateful to all of you who have participated in this discussion over the past, now since Childless Millennial, it's been over 4 years, like almost to, it was Childless Millennial Part 1 was October 2020. Crazy. Now I'm a millennial with child, a proud mother, and a person that will still fight to the death to make sure that you don't bruit your death by the hands of uninformed, egotistical monster politicians who galvanize voters for sport by placing policies that put our lives at risk, put our future families in jeopardy. And I'm not here for it, never will be. And on that front, you can't change my mind, although I'm open to general well-intentioned feedback. Have a good weekend. Vote early if you can, just in case something happens on Tuesday. But I know you guys will make sure of it. But, I love the multitudes of the Beths. I mean, this is right now, I'm recording this the morning of Friday, November 1st. I mean, in the past 3 days, I've wept alongside your deeply vulnerable stories. I've been trying to figure out the best way to fight for our reproductive freedom. But in between editing this episode, I dressed as Taylor Swift from Reputation, recorded the spooky snorkel episode, and also put my mom, my baby, and I in blue pea coats as we dressed as Mom Talk from The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives for Halloween. All of 3 passing by trick-or-treater parents understood what the hell we were dressed as. Sometimes I feel the range of the show is whiplash-inducing, but sometimes I feel deeply proud of it. So thank you for being here. But it's Friday, the election is Tuesday, and I still remain hopeful. And all that's left to say is let me know your thoughts, and I'll let you know mine. I'll be there in 5 days, I swear. Don't forget to vote in 5 days.